Good afternoon. The first item of business is time for reflection, and our time for reflection leader today is Reverend Callum MacLeod, moderator of the Free Church of Scotland.
Presiding Officer, members of the Scottish Parliament, it is an honour for me to lead the time of reflection for today. Having served in the pastoral ministry for over 24 years, I discovered that the key to effective service is to acknowledge our own insufficiency for the task and to reach beyond ourselves for the help that enables effective, life-changing service. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States of America, when he left his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, to take up office, said, and I quote, "I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of the divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail." Abraham Lincoln recognised his need for help from the living God, and he proved in his time to be a political genius and an effective leader. Solomon succeeded David as king over God's covenant people in the Old Testament. Recognising the huge task ahead of him, he made the following request to God. "And now, O Lord my God, your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, for who is able to govern this great people?" God gave King Solomon the wisdom he requested. He was famous as the king who established righteousness and justice in the land. The Apostle Paul, the servant of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, wrote to the church in Corinth in AD 55. Corinth was a busy commercial city, divided in its allegiance to leadership, disoriented in its morality, and diverse in its understanding of the source of wisdom. Paul offered a single unified answer. Jesus Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Paul had previously depended on his own resources, but he now wants to share with them what he discovered for himself, saying, "Jesus became wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption." In the midst of the complex issues that you seek to address as a Parliament, I commend to you the wisdom from God that made Abraham Lincoln, King Solomon and the Apostle Paul life-changing servants of the people in their own time. Praying the Lord's blessing on you all in your deliberations. Thank you. Tap life.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend. Our next item of business is topical questions, and at question number 1 I call Carol Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to prevent the spread of avian influenza following the outbreak in Kirriemuir.
Minister Jim Fairley.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank Carol Mochan for bringing this to the attention of the Chamber. I will make one point right at the start. The outbreak is not actually in Kirriemuir, it's in Kingoldrum, but that means that the protection zone is around a 3-mile perimeter from the area that has been infected. Kirriemuir sits within the surveillance zone, not within the protection zone. I think it's quite important that that point is clarified. So on the 10th of January 2025, following the confirmation of the presence of the highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 in poultry, the Scottish Government activated its plans and immediately declared a 3-kilometre protection zone and a 10-kilometre surveillance zone around the infected premises, placing controls on poultry products and other things that could spread disease. Any remaining birds on an infected premises are humanely culled, disposed of safely, and disinfection of the premises is carried out. A veterinary inquiry is now underway by the Animal, Plant and Health Agency to assess the source and the potential spread within the area.
Carol Mochan.
I thank the Minister for that clarity and his response. The second outbreak, this is the second outbreak seen in the area in recent years, and we've been told, I believe, that there have been this has been detected in 2 wild birds in Fife and Perth. So my question is, farmers across Scotland and in particular in my region of South Scotland do want a reassurance that sufficient safeguards are in place to prevent future outbreaks, and in particular that high winds and flooding are not weakening those safeguards. So I wonder if the Minister could provide some reassurance on that point. Minister.
As the member is probably aware, this is a wildly occurring pathogen which can get into domestic poultry. So the advice is very clear that the keepers of poultry should be carrying out as much of the biosecurity as we are required to ask them to do, particularly within the protection zone and within the surveillance zone. But all poultry keepers should at all times be ensuring the best biosecurity that they have in order to protect their flocks.
Carol Mochan.
Thank you, Minister. My last question is around the sort of link. So, avian influenza has devastated wild bird populations across the country, and we do know that transmission from birds to humans is rare and risk of human health is low. But several people around the world have been infected. I wonder if the Scottish Government can advise people on what biosecurity steps people and organisations can take to reduce the spread of avian influenza in Scotland.
Minister.
Well, there has never actually been a case in Scotland, to my knowledge, of avian influenza passing to a human. On very rare occasions, it can be transmitted to humans. However, globally, there is no evidence of an occasion of a human-to-human spread of this virus. There have been a number of cases in the United States recently associated with outbreaks in wild birds, poultry and in dairy cattle herds. But the majority of these cases have been mild clinical cases. There was one death of an individual in Louisiana who had underlying health conditions, but that was also attributable to an infection of H5N1. And there is no evidence that any of the United States strains are circulating in UK or Europe. So we, at this moment in time, we don't have any evidence that we have any issues with it being transmitted to humans.
Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister set out to the Chamber the importance of poultry keepers remaining vigilant and ensuring high standards of biosecurity? And is the Minister able to give us examples of what this looks like in practice?
Minister. Thanks, Presiding Officer. It's a legal requirement for suspicion of avian influenza to be reported immediately. That allows the Government to advocate its contingency plans speedily and effectively, and that minimises the potential further impact on other premises and birds. And the best way in which keepers can protect their flocks is by applying those strict biosecurity measures that I just mentioned. And that's principally aimed at avoiding direct or indirect contact between their flocks and infected wild bird species, which is the main route of infection. And this can take the form of ensuring that feed and water is stored where it can't be contaminated by wild birds, and maintaining bird houses to prevent the ingress of wild birds, rodents or floodwater, cleansing and disinfecting clothing and footwear before any contact with kept birds is also vital.
Thank you. Question number 2, Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what early assessment it has made following the opening of the safer drug consumption facility, the Thistle.
Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased that the Thistle has started supporting its first service users as of yesterday. Early engagement information will be reported in due course, but I understand that uptake was good, taking into account the presence of some media near the entrance and that this was the very first day of a unique service. There was, however, very positive feedback from the first service users. So I would like to thank all involved in getting the service up and running, the staff, those from the various engagement groups and those from the local community for their support for this facility and those relentless campaigners that allowed this to happen.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I use my first question to look at the policing of this facility? And I remind the Chamber that my wife is a serving officer with Police Scotland. The Lord Advocate and the police have said people will not be prosecuted for drug possession within the facility. But can the Cabinet Secretary outline what the Government expects to happen out with the facility? For example, what is the Cabinet Secretary and the Government's view of someone in possession of drugs on their way to the facility, should those drugs be removed if the police have good cause to stop them and find them in possession of the drugs? And what is the Cabinet Secretary's response to concerns in the local community that the area could become a criminal hotspot if the police are not policing immediately outside the new facility?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank Douglas Ross for his question, and he'll understand that this is an operational matter for Police Scotland. It wouldn't be right for me to comment on nor influence the decisions that they make. However, Police Scotland have been involved in the development of this proposal from the beginning. I'm very grateful for their support. It wouldn't have been possible to reach this point without their collaboration and partnership working. As part of the proposal which went to the Lord Advocate, Police Scotland provided a paper which was signed off by the Chief Constable, which clearly set out their position. That paper makes clear that the role of police officers and explains how the area surrounding the safer drug consumption facility would be policed in the same manner as it was prior to the establishment of the facility, unless otherwise required due to any new identified risk. So Police Scotland will not alter the approach that they take to patrolling a community as a result of this facility open and ensure all communities in Scotland receive the same standard of service.
Douglas Ross.
There's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the policing, and I don't think that will be answered by the Cabinet Secretary's response there. He says it's a matter for Police Scotland. Police Scotland are saying it's a matter for the Crown Office, but ultimately this is a facility that is supported by the Scottish Government, and I don't think it's unreasonable for parliamentarians to expect a response to this here today. Can I, however, look at the facility in more general detail? Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what he believes will be a success of this pilot project? Over the next 3 years, how will he judge it a success or otherwise? And does he accept, as the First Minister said yesterday, this is not a silver bullet? We need more joined-up working across this area. For example, if people go in there to inject themselves with drugs but need mental health support, they will still face lengthy waiting lists, and there is still a huge shortage of rehabilitation beds in Scotland. So is it not the case that this facility will simply make it more sustainable for people to remain on drugs rather than getting off drugs, turning their lives around, and by backing the Right to Recovery Bill, that would be another element in our fight against the appalling drug death rate here in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I accept that this is one tool in the box. It's not the silver bullet, as Douglas Ross describes it as. He asks about how we would measure the success over the 3 years of the pilot. This is about reducing harm and reducing deaths within Glasgow. It's also about allowing people who have we've been otherwise unable to reach, in terms of the treatment options that Douglas Ross speaks about, coming in and accessing services that are available within the facility itself. So that is the basis upon which the Lord Advocate gave her statement of prosecution policy, which was that this was about allowing people to get access to a service that otherwise they would not have been able to get access to. So that is the first opportunity for many people to have those conversations around the likes of mental health support, around other treatment options such as residential rehabilitation. And it's also not an either-or scenario. This is additional funding that we're putting in here, alongside the additional funding that we've put into the likes of residential rehabilitation beds that have seen those bed numbers rise by 20% since 2021, because we recognise that this is a national mission that has to be focused on all possible forms of intervention that can save lives. Because I agree with Douglas Ross, the situation is appalling and one that we must face, but we must make sure that we take all possible steps, including those that feel radical, like this one, to ensure that we get to all of those people that can potentially benefit from the services that are available across Scotland.
Thank you. There is much interest, and I'd be grateful for concise questions and responses. I call Claire Haughey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I remind Chamber I'm employed as a bank nurse by Greater Glasgow and Clyde NHS. Every death related to drug use is one too many and utterly devastating for those loved ones left behind. And while this facility is not a silver bullet, I'm proud of this significant step to reduce harms and deaths in one of Scotland's most impacted cities. Can the Cabinet Secretary speak to how the Scottish Government engaged with those with lived experience and families to ensure the facility met the needs and best supports service users?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I thank Claire Haughey for her question, and I absolutely agree with her that a life lost to a drug dependency is one life too many. And I was able, alongside the First Minister, to speak to bereaved families that were part of the process of establishing the Safer Drug Consumption Facility when we visited the facility on Friday, as well as others with lived experience who have helped in the design of the facility, the way that it looks, the way that it feels, right the way down to being part of the interview panel for some of the staff to make sure that the cultural aspects of who is employed and how they approach their work is informed by lived experience. That is absolutely critical to the confidence of the community in the facility and of service users with it, but also in making sure that the endeavours that we're seeking to address around reducing harm and reducing the number of deaths are able to be addressed as well. And I'm very grateful for all those with lived experience, as well as service users and bereaved families, for the input that they have had in getting the Thistle to this point.
Thank you, Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I share the sentiments members across the Chamber in welcoming the opening of the overdose prevention pilot on an official basis in Glasgow. I was fortunate enough to visit last week with the Joint Committee on Tackling Drug Deaths and Drug Harm, and it was quite clear to me that the facility is equipped to provide an opportunity to reach the established cohort of people in Glasgow who inject drugs in public and support them with other support or resources as they may need. And as such, I've always said that this facility has to be accessible and integrated with other services, particularly residential rehabilitation, given that the nearest such facility is Phoenix Futures in Anniesland, some 5 miles away. So can the Cabinet Secretary reassure the Chamber that this facility will be geared towards supporting people where they're at without judgment or without setting tests that people are doomed to fail, and advise what assessment the Scottish Government has made of extending the opening hours of the facility from 12 hours a day as present, and can you also provide an update on the approval of a licence for a drug checking facility at the site?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I thank Mr Sweeney for his interest and his long-standing interest in campaigning in this field. Like him, I was able to see, along with the First Minister on Friday, the facility for myself and the approach that staff are taking, which is that stigma-free way that he asks it to be. Of course, in terms of opening hours, that's a decision for the Health and Social Care Partnership to take. We have provided funding to enable the Health and Social Care Partnership to get to this point, but it's for them to determine whether a shift in the opening hours is needed or would help in terms of the pilot. In terms of the location, again, my understanding is that, and I heard that on Friday, has been very deliberately picked to be near where there has been a widespread community injecting happening, and to ensure that we are providing a service that is as close as possible to that particular element, to avoid that community injecting happening and to bring it into a safer space. And of course, as I said in response to Douglas Ross, the whole premise of the Lord Advocate's statement of prosecution policy was about this being a gateway to getting people access to treatment and a road to recovery. And so the integration of the services, both within the facility itself, as he'll know, the wide range of services that are available there, but also to the residential rehab facilities, is absolutely crucial, I believe, to the success of this pilot.
Thank you. Ash Regan.
I'd like to ask the Government specifically, and I know that the Minister has already been asked this question, didn't put any specifics on the record, but what metrics will actually be used in order to assess the success of Thistle, and what ongoing lessons will the Government draw from global examples such as Stanford University's Professor Humphrey's analysis to ensure that safer consumption rooms are part of a balanced and also a recovery-focused strategy in order to tackle drug deaths?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Ash Regan for her question. I've already set out in response to Douglas Ross that the success of the pilot will be based on the harm reduction and the reduction in the number of drug-related deaths that we see within the vicinity. And I am quite rightly held accountable on a regular basis as to the national picture, and obviously we can see localised numbers around those drug death statistics that will clearly demonstrate over time what the pattern is and whether there is a new pattern emerging as a result of this measure. But I reiterate that this is just one measure, and the second part of her question is instructive. This is one part of our national mission that goes alongside the naloxone programme, that goes alongside the expansion of residential rehab, that goes alongside the community and voluntary sector funding that we provide through the Cora Foundation, and a range of other things, including the point that was raised by Paul Sweeney that I didn't get to around drug checking facilities, where our engagement with the Home Office continues. So this is just one part of a wide suite of investment that we're making to reduce the number of drug deaths, and I look forward to being able to see an improving picture there, as I know Ash Regan does as well.
And Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The question that Douglas Ross asked specifically was about measurements of success, metrics. Ash Regan has asked the same question. I'm going to ask the question again, because I'm not sure the Cabinet Secretary is being anything other than vague. He's definite about the fact that a key measurement will be the reduction in drugs deaths in Glasgow. We get that. He then talks about harm reduction. What are the metrics that will be used to measure harm reduction? What does it mean?
The evidence internationally, and I know Stephen Kerr will be aware of this, the evidence internationally is the efficacy of drug consumption facilities in reducing the wider harm prevention measures, such as the reduction in infections that come from needle exchanges, so the reduction in the levels of HIV, of hepatitis and other viruses that result from that type of behaviour occurring. Those are some of the areas that I'm talking about in terms of harm reduction. The other areas that I would want to be able to point to is an increased engagement with some of the statutory and community services within Glasgow as a result of people that we have not been able to engage with previously, and some of the evidence coming through from the first day yesterday is that the people coming through the door were people that those services were able to see for the first time. And those are people that we're able to have conversations with on a different path, a road to recovery for the first time. And so there are a number of areas. I understand that there will be a vagueness to that because it is a preventative measure, and it's something that, aside from hard-nosed drug death statistics, it's hard to measure on. But I think those are areas that I would want to point to in terms of having made a difference with this safer consumption facility.
Thank you. That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is a statement by Shirley-Ann Somerville on winter heating payment. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end. Point of order, Paul O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And on a point of order, I seek your guidance regarding this afternoon's statement. It appears that, once again, the content of this statement has appeared in the media prior to the statement being made to Parliament. Indeed, I note that the Scottish Government appeared to have an embargoed press release on their website at a minute past midnight. And I raise this, Presiding Officer, simply because it is not the first time that issues of this nature regarding winter heating payment assistance and more broadly have been pre-briefed to the media. And if it is the contention of the Government that there is no detail in this statement that wasn't already in the public domain, then it will perhaps beg the question for people, what is the point of the statement at all? But the principle here, Presiding Officer, I believe, is that this chamber should be the place where statements are made and not the media, and I would appreciate your guidance on this matter.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. I think members are well aware of my expectations, in line with long-established guidance, that where a ministerial statement has been scheduled, the content of that statement must be made first of all to this Parliament. Now, I have not had an opportunity to look into the matter that Mr O'Kane raises, but I will certainly do so. I will pick up where I was with regards to the next item of business. There's a statement by Shirley-Ann Somerville on the winter heating payment, and the Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be able to make a statement to the Chamber today, as asked for by the Scottish Conservatives, on the uptake of the winter heating payment across the last 5 years. Winter heating payment is the Scottish Government benefit to support people on low incomes with the cost of heating over the winter months. Our benefit replaced the DWP's cold weather payment in winter 2022-23. It provides a targeted, reliable and guaranteed annual payment of £58.75 to those most in need of help with their energy costs every winter, including people of pension age, disabled adults and families who have a responsibility for either a child under the age of 5 or a disabled child. The UK Government's cold weather payment previously provided £25 per cold spell only when the average of the mean daily temperature recorded was equal to or below 0 degrees for 7 consecutive days, an entire week. This UK Government benchmark is, of course, totally arbitrary. Temperatures are measured at weather stations often miles from people's homes, failing to take into account other factors such as wind, chill and driving rain, which can have a major impact on the temperature of people's homes, particularly, of course, those on low incomes. This UK Government reliance on an arbitrary and arcane definition of what is cold and what isn't meant, for example, that in winter 21-22 in areas of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Shetland, Orkney, Wick and Fife, for example, absolutely no payments were made, not a single one. Importantly, when planning our winter heating payment, we listened carefully to feedback from our public consultation and our social security experience panels, as we do with all our benefits, of course, which we co-design with the people who will be receiving them, a marked difference between our approach and the UK Government's. And what people told us is that they overwhelmingly supported the removal of the cold spell requirement. Age UK similarly supported the removal of this requirement and has called on the UK Government to do the same. That's why our winter heating payment breaks the link with an arbitrarily defined winter weather dependency and provides financial support, no matter the weather, so that low-income households will automatically be paid and know that they're going to be paid and do not have the uncertainty of waiting for weather readings for 7 consecutive days before receiving a payment. Due to the cold spell requirements, as few as 4,000 people received a payment in 2019-20 and just 11,000 getting one in 21-22. In sharp contrast, when our winter heating payment was launched in 2022-23, the total number of people who received it were 398,240. Official statistics show that more than 453,000 people got winter heating payments last winter from the Scottish Government, thanks to an investment of £25 million. This winter, we will invest even more, £26.8 million for winter heating payment. And that more than triples the £8.5 million provided on average by the DWP in the last 7 years prior to the introduction of our payment. As of the 15th of December 2024, over 218,000 winter heating payments have so far been made to people this winter, totalling £12.8 million, with the remaining payments due to be completed by the end of next month. In recognition of the current pressures on household budgets, winter heating payment was uprated by 10.1% from £50 to £55.05 for winter 23-24 and by a further 6.7% for this winter to £58.75. Eligibility to winter heating payment is linked to the receipt of relevant reserve benefits such as universal credit and pension credit, among others. And while Scottish ministers have no formal role in the administration of reserve benefits, the Scottish Government is absolutely committed to ensuring that Scottish people are supported to take up benefits they are entitled to. We have committed to investing over £12 million for the provision of free income maximisation support, welfare and debt advice services in 24-25, including support for the Citizens Advice Scotland Money Talk Team service, which last year supported over 9,000 older people as part of our coordinated benefit take-up strategy. Of course, winter heating payment is not the only form of support the Scottish Government provides to help people to meet their heating costs. In November, I announced that the Scottish Government will invest a further £20 million in the Scottish Welfare Fund's budget to be distributed to councils this financial year, in line with the existing distribution arrangements agreed with COSLA. This increase will help councils meet increased demands upon the fund and will go some way to providing vital support to people in crisis. I also confirmed that we will invest an additional £20 million into the Warmer Homes Scotland scheme, our national fuel poverty scheme, taking the total investment in this scheme to £85 million this financial year. This scheme focuses on long-term sustainable measures, and this additional funding will help approximately 1,500 additional households to install energy efficiency measures and more efficient heating systems, saving on average around £400 per year per household on energy bills. And most importantly, in November I announced that ahead of next winter I will bring forward regulations to introduce a universal pension age winter heating payment in winter 25-26 for every Scottish pensioner household of at least £100, with those in receipt of relevant low-income benefits receiving £200 or £300 depending on their age. This universal benefit will provide much-needed support and not available anywhere else in the UK. And it will deliver support to all Scottish pensioner households, as we had always intended to do before the UK Government decision to cut the winter fuel payment. We are also continuing our child winter heating payment, which last year provided £7.8 million to support over 33,000 children, young people and their families who had higher energy needs due to disability or a health condition. This benefit is not available elsewhere in the UK. In total, this winter, we are forecasted to invest over £65 million in our 3 winter heating benefits, which will provide vital support to over 630,000 people with their energy bills. All of these programmes provide valuable support with energy bills to people across Scotland. But as I have previously highlighted to this chamber, we all recognise that households across the country acutely feel twin pressures. Firstly, cuts to the social security budgets made over many years by successive UK governments, Conservative and now Labour. And secondly, rising energy costs, despite Labour's promise before the election that people's energy bills would fall if they were in government. Of course, they are set to rise again this month. Presiding Officer, this year alone, the Scottish Government has already spent £134 million mitigating the effects of UK Government welfare decisions, and in doing so we are working closely with our partners in local government across Scotland, supporting people in crisis. Although we can't mitigate every decision made by the UK Government, we are determined to provide support for the people of Scotland. Our winter heating payment is just one example of how we are using our devolved powers to make a positive difference and to support the people of Scotland with their rising energy costs. Reliable, guaranteed, not dependent on arbitrary temperature readings, designed in partnership with the people who are receiving it, and providing support to more than double the number of people who previously got help under the DWP, our winter heating payment is a very clear example of how this Scottish Government is doing more to support the people of Scotland through the long, cold winter months.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. And I'd be grateful if members who wish to put a question were to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on Liz Smith.
Well, thank you for the statement, Cabinet Secretary. But of course, the Scottish Government's proposed pension age winter fuel payment for winter 2025-26 is not actually a reinstatement of the pension of the previous UK Government's winter heating payment, as that payment provided £200 to every pensioner and £300 to those over 80 years old. But the Scottish Government's policy gives £100 as a universal payment. So can I actually ask the Cabinet Secretary, what criteria did the Scottish Government use to make this different policy decision, which obviously does not reinstate the previous payment? And secondly, what did the Scottish Government, did they give any consideration to whether the winter heating payment should include extra support for extreme weather situations, even if they disagreed with the previous criteria?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I am a bit confused about the principles behind where the Scottish Conservatives want to go on social security, because in budget debates and indeed in First Minister's questions we're continually challenged to cut social security expenditure, and now Liz Smith seems to be asking me to spend more money on a scheme than we are already providing. And if Liz Smith genuinely wishes to do that, then of course budget negotiations are continuing, and she can explain to me and to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance where that money would come from to be able to deliver that. We've gone over, Presiding Officer, in great detail previously the details of the pension age winter heating payment, and I am very, very pleased that this Government will reintroduce a universal winter heating payment for all pensioner households. I think that's exactly what people would expect their government to do. And in terms of the questions around the overall winter heating payment for those on low incomes, again, I take from that Liz Smith thinks we should be doing more than we already are, and therefore spending more on social security than we already are. I went through in my statement why I think the principles behind the policy that we have, based on that co-design with people, have provided extra support, financial certainty for people at important times. But again, if Liz Smith wishes us to spend more money on social security, then I'm happy to have those discussions with her. But let's be honest about what the intent is behind those questions, and whether she would actually genuinely wish me to deliver that. And if she did, that would be taking part in the budget discussions, and to date, Presiding Officer, it has not.
Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement. And the Cabinet Secretary and colleagues have said much in recent weeks about the impact of winter pressures and cold temperatures, but the statement today appears to be old numbers being put together in a new way to suggest that the Scottish Government is taking action on these issues, and perhaps that's why it was pre-briefed to the media. So I wonder if I can ask the Cabinet Secretary, because we've had this conversation in the Chamber before. The Scottish Labour have been calling on a package of measures to support people this winter from that £41 million consequential from the Household Support Fund, which the Cabinet Secretary said didn't exist. Instead, what the Cabinet Secretary seems to have announced is simply plugging gaps that were created by real terms cuts in the previous budget. And we've had no detail since that statement on the practical measures to deploy the funding. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would outline how much of that funding is already out of the door and how many people it is supporting. And finally, the Cabinet Secretary is aware that we have called for the reinstatement of the Fuel Insecurity Fund as an alternative mechanism to use those consequentials targeting those most in need. And FOI responses have shown that when the Government made the decision to cut that fund, fuel insecurity partners expressed great concern that they could no longer, quote, deliver innovative measures that were taking people out of crisis situations. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would agree that that move was regrettable, and will she confirm if the Scottish Government have looked at the option to revive that in line with calls from this side of the Chamber and campaigners?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the reason that the figures in the statement today is the figures that are already in the public domain is because we regularly produce and publish statements. And the reason I'm here today is that I was asked if the Government could actually do this statement, and here I am delivering that statement. So I genuinely don't get why Paul O'Kane is surprised that the figures are already in the public domain. He usually complains that we don't publish enough information, Presiding Officer. But this £41 million, again, we're going over old ground, but let's go over it again just one more time. Until there is certainty about the totality of in-year consequentials, then I'm sorry, I don't think it is sensible for the Government to actually start talking and putting money out the door until that certainty is there. And that's the difference, Presiding Officer, about being responsible about the public finances in Scotland and then what Mr O'Kane is asking me to do. If he wishes to see money going into the Fuel Insecurity Fund, again, I go back to the point I've made to Liz Smith. The budget for next year is not yet passed. If he wishes to see that money coming forward, perhaps that's what might tempt him off the fence from abstaining and actually vote for the budget, as well as the mitigation for the two-child cap and as well as the reintroduction of universal payments. And, Presiding Officer, the best way to actually support people that are having difficulty with energy costs is the social tariff. That's work that this Scottish Government, along with energy providers, is getting on with for the benefit of the UK Government, who should be doing that work, but we'll get on and do the work. And then once we have that working group with recommendations, they better get on and to deliver that.
Christine Graham, to be followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, I very much welcome the universal £100 winter fuel payment for 25-26 to all pensioners not able to access a Labour Government means-tested UK winter fuel payment, not, of course, in the pre-election manifesto, suddenly leaving many pensioners literally out in the cold. But many pensioners like me are fortunate enough not to require the previous £300 and we paid it over to local charities. While this would still be available with £100, that is, to remit to local charities, would it be possible for the Scottish Government to provide a means by which those pensioners, like me, could repay that money to the Scottish Government or indeed opt out? Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Christine Graham for this question, because I think it is a very important aspect as we try to look at the best way to use the finances that we have to support people. So under our planned universal pension age winter heating payment, clients will be able to opt out if they do not wish to receive one. In order to opt out of a payment, clients will first need to be on the Social Security Scotland systems. So for this reason, for the first year of launch, clients will not be able to opt out until after Social Security Scotland has received and processed the client data from the DWP. But from year 2 onwards, we are working towards the introduction of a system within the agency where we will have the data available to manage client opt-out. So I hope that responds to the direct ask from Christine Graham, and it's a very important point that we are endeavouring to build into the system in future years.
Jeremy Balfour, to be followed by Emma Roddick.
Presiding Officer, according to the statement, I think over half the people entitled to a payment have not received any money as of 15th December, and it will be another 5 weeks until everybody receives the entitlement they are due to. Could the Cabinet Secretary tell us why there is such a delay in these payments coming through, and in the year ahead, will these be paid earlier than they have been paid this year?
Cabinet Secretary.
So we have moved the payments forward, Presiding Officer. The first year in 22-23, the payments weren't coming through until spring, so we have already moved that forward. The reason for the last payments being made in February is because we take a second sweep of data from the DWP to ensure that those that are fully eligible at that time of entitlement are gathered up within the final payment. So the reason why there is 5 weeks until the last people are paid are because we wait that DWP information to ensure we've swept up absolutely everybody that is entitled to. So that's the right thing to do to ensure that we are getting as many people paid as possible. And I hope that gives Mr Balfour reassurance that that's a sensible final step in the process to ensure people get the money that they're entitled to.
Emma Roddick, to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Having spent the last week at home in the Highlands, I know just how harsh the cold that many of my constituents are facing right now is. And I'm glad that the Scottish Government continues to deliver different winter heating payments to them, despite Labour's decision to inexplicably remove funding from pensioners across the Highlands and Islands this winter. Can the Cabinet Secretary share what the uptake has been like for the different Scottish winter heating payments in the Highlands and Islands region?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think perhaps the best way to respond to that is once, as I've said to Mr Balfour, that final payment session is through within 5 weeks, and then I'll be able to give Emma Roddick the full picture of what's happening within the Highland and Islands region. She does point to the very important example, and I alluded to it in my statement, that many communities did not receive any payments in previous years, particularly those in island authorities, and that's a difference that we've been making to that. I'll give an example of Orkney, Shetland, for example, that are receiving that benefit that we would not have done so during the previous scheme. But I will revert to the member in writing once this year's payments are fully completed to give her that information, and I hope reassurance about how we are delivering right across the Highlands and Islands.
Colin Smith, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary referred to funding for the Warmer Homes Scotland scheme, but what discussions has she had with her colleagues over the consistent failure of the Government to spend the budget it sets aside for area-based energy efficiency projects? Does she not agree that failing to spend £62 million of the £192 million allocated in the last 3 years is appalling, and as is the fact that research by the Chartered Institute of Building shows that less than 40% of older people are even aware of the Government's energy efficiency schemes?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the member raises a very important point about raising awareness on the schemes that are available, and that becomes even more prescient when we see people who are no longer entitled to support in other ways. If the member will forgive me, I'll get back to him in writing, or perhaps one of my colleagues will, as the specific aspects around that policy are within the net zero portfolio, and I'll provide to that response to him in writing.
Thank you. Bob Doris, to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Presiding Officer, when Labour ditched the universal winter heating payment for older people, they abandoned many vulnerable older people, not least of all those who qualify for pension credit but who do not claim it and who can be particularly vulnerable. Pension credit uptake may be a UK responsibility, but will the Scottish Government give details of what it will do to maximise uptake and to boost pension income, so that, unlike the UK Government, we continue to do the right thing by Scotland's pensioners?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Bob Doris raises a very important point about the need to encourage people and support people to ensure that they're getting the benefits that they're entitled to. That's why Scotland has a benefit take-up strategy when it comes to our devolved benefits. We're the only part of the UK that does so. And even where we don't have responsibility, as Mr Doris points out, for pension credit, we are very keen to make sure we're doing as much as possible. So work within Social Security Scotland around encouraging the take-up of pension credit has been one example. And I would also put on record again my thanks to councils who have also worked exceptionally hard to attempt to increase the level of take-up within pension credit. That's a very important piece of work that they have also been undertaken, and I thank them for doing so.
Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. This payment in Scotland is undoubtedly very welcome, but should we not be looking beyond mitigation at what we can be doing to ensure everyone lives in comfortably warm homes, whatever the weather, whatever the season, whatever their income? Too many homes are poorly insulated and drafty. A warmth audit of all domestic properties, perhaps starting with those in receipt of winter heating payments, might be a more transformative approach if that audit was then responded to systematically. Is this something the Cabinet Secretary would consider?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Maggie Chapman for that suggestion, and again I think it points out to the ways that statements like this can provide potential solutions for challenges that we're all sharing. I'm sure Maggie Chapman and her other colleagues within the Scottish Greens are also again taking part in those budgetary discussions with the Scottish Government as we move forward with our budget process, and if she wishes that to be a priority that is looked at both by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and my colleague Gillian Martin in Net Zero, will be happy to take that under consideration as we go forward with our budgetary discussions.
Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Marie McNair.
Thank you. While help with fuel bills is, of course, welcome, we must do more to bring down the overall cost of those bills. Area-based energy efficiency schemes have proven their worth, and more funding for these, again, is welcome. Yet too often councils have insufficient notice of funding allocations, and some appear unable to spend what they are given. Orkney Islands Council has consistently made full use of the area-based funding available in an area with the highest level of fuel poverty in the country. So, like Colin Smith, can I urge the Government to review the scheme's operation to ensure councils get more notice or indeed multi-year funding, and that where there are risks of underspends, reallocation of funds can take place in a timely fashion?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Liam MacArthur for that question? He again raised a very important point around certainty of funding. And if I can particularly focus on the request for multi-year funding, I do think that's something that the Government takes very seriously. It's a call that's made over a number of parts of different portfolios within Government, and I recognise the point he's making here. Clearly it is challenging for the Scottish Government to move forward with further multi-year commitments when the budget given to the Scottish Government is only on a one-year basis. And that does make it more challenging. That's why the work that's been undertaken by the UK Government for spending reviews is exceptionally important in this. It will hope I provide some degree of certainty about what's happening within Scottish Government budgets over future years, and therefore allow us to take more decisions around where multi-year expenditure can be undertaken. We are endeavouring to do that already, both in revenue and capital, in different areas of government, whether it's in the third sector, whether it's in culture, for example. But I take the point that he's making around this and the need for that type of certainty in this area too.
Marie McNair, to be followed by Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Labour promises a new direction, but now we see it means they will rush in brutal cuts to winter support for pensioners. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that this betrayal underlines just how important it is that decisions on winter heating benefits are made here, where our devolved Parliament can listen to vulnerable households and make the right decisions for the people of Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I noticed Marie McNair's quite rightly also recognising that Labour are now talking about a new direction. I take it, Presiding Officer, they realised that change line wasn't quite working when people were realising no change was actually happening. She does raise a very important point, and it goes to how we talk about social security. We had a near consensus, with the exception of the Scottish Conservatives, I think, talking about social security as an investment in people and in our communities. We now have Scottish Labour, and I see again on the front pages of some of the papers today, Presiding Officer, the UK Labour Government talking about handouts and cuts to social security. And I think that's a very, very obvious difference between how this Government is attempting, with the financial resources that we have, to deliver for people still impacted by a cost of living crisis, and a UK Government and Scottish Labour that seem to be both in step talking about handouts and actually increasing stigma towards people in social security. And I think that's a deeply disappointing new direction for Labour.
Craig Hoy, to be followed by Colette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2024, a number of energy suppliers restarted the process of installing prepaid meters without consent for customers who had fallen into debt. Given that those on prepaid meters are often the poorest and most vulnerable in society, and that they often pay more per unit for gas and electricity, will the Cabinet Secretary work with Ofgem to identify how many pensioner and other households are on PPMs in Scotland? And will she press for an amnesty to allow existing customers to opt out of prepaid meters and explore a ban on the future involuntary installations of the meters now and into the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, it's a very important point that Craig Hoy is raising. One of the challenges we do have, I'll be frank, Presiding Officer, is a great deal of the powers within these areas is not for the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament, but lie down in Westminster. But that does not stop the Government using its convening powers and the powers of facilitation to be able to work with energy providers. I recently met, for example, with energy providers on the issues concerning housing. He does raise an important point about the difficulties that those in prepayment meters have and the impact that those can have on the debt levels and people's ability to heat their homes. And I think it's another area where we need to look very carefully at what the Government can do here, using its convening and facilitation powers, and what we must continue to persuade the UK Government or Ofgem to be able to take forward.
Colette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Under the previous UK cold weather payments for East Kilbride residents were conditional on the weather recorded at Bishopton. And given the different winter climates, this disadvantaged people in East Kilbride who often got no payout even when it was below freezing in the town. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how many more people are benefiting from the Scottish Government's winter heating payment across the country? And can she assure households in East Kilbride that the injustice of the old Westminster scheme is now a thing of the past?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think it's fitting that we have a question about East Kilbride from Colette Stevenson on this, because I remember very clearly as we debated what this new statement, this new benefit would look like when it was devolved. Her predecessor, Linda Fabiani, was one of the most vociferous campaigners to ensure that we got rid of the injustice of the previous arbitrary systems, because it did not reflect what was happening in her local area. I'm very pleased that the Scottish Government has been able to deliver that certainty for the constituents of Colette Stevenson and indeed members across the chamber, and I'll respond to her in writing, as I will with Emma Roddick, about the totality of the provision both in her constituency and, I hope, throughout Scotland, to be able to reassure her about the difference that we have made once again this winter.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement. I will allow a moment or two for front benches to organise for the next item of business.
Okay, the next item of business is debate on motion 16092 in the name of Angus Robertson on valuing culture, Scotland's support to the culture sector. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Angus Robertson to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, around 13 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to open the debate today about how the Scottish Government and members right across the chamber can best support Scotland's culture sector so that it can continue to develop, to innovate and ultimately to thrive. And I move the motion that stands in my name. I spoke to the Chamber before about the intrinsic value and the transformational potential of culture, but if you'll permit me, I'd like to begin today by borrowing some words about the value of culture crafted by our nation's new maker, the accomplished and highly regarded multilingual poet Peter Mackay. He wrote, "Culture and art is the space in which accidents happen for the better, where things collide into each other to form something new and unexpected, where we take all that we have learnt from the past and use it to fail again, to fail better, in previously unimagined ways, and in so doing, make a space in which other people too can think about the world afresh." And I'd like to thank Peter for expressing the unique power and the vital nature of culture in such an impactful way as a force essential to our development as human beings, as communities and as a nation on the world stage. The Scottish Government's culture strategy for Scotland recognises how central culture is to our country's future prosperity and sets out a vision of a Scotland where everyone is able to live a cultural life of their own choosing. And we're now, of course,
Sarah Boyack.
And I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking my intervention. It fits into his points about the importance of culture to our communities. Has the Cabinet Secretary met with East Lothian Council or the Brunton Theatre Trust to discuss the future of the Brunton Theatre, given it's a key cultural venue in Musselburgh and East Lothian and urgently needs funding to secure its future?
Cabinet Secretary.
I haven't yet met either with the Council or with the theatre, but I have offered to. And if there's a wish and a willingness to do so, of course, I would be content to do just that. We're now at a critical point in deciding how we collectively want to support culture in Scotland, how a nation values its many cultures and heritages, its artists, its creative people and its communities, is an insight into the wider values and the priorities of that society, and I'd ask members to reflect on that during the debate. As Culture Secretary, I'm immensely proud of what is already being achieved in Scotland. The 2022 Anhalt Ipsos Nation Brands Index ranked Scotland 11th for its cultural heritage and 12th for the contemporary culture when compared to 60 other participating nations. This is a testament to the expertise, the dedication, the practice of our cultural organisations, of our creative professionals and our cultural workers, and to the vitality of community culture right across the country. In the last few years alone, I've witnessed astonishing growth in the screen sector in Scotland, with more quality productions choosing to come to Scotland from Leith to Stornoway than ever before. And many of you will have seen The Outrun, for example, just one of the recent examples of a successful Screen Scotland supported production which used the natural beauty of the Orkney Islands to stunning effect. And today sees the first broadcast of high-end Gaelic drama television series Anchaelin, the Island, that can be seen on BBC Alapa, on BBC 4 and on the BBC iPlayer. And I'd like to extend congratulations to MG Alapa, to BBC Alapa, to Black Camel Pictures, All Three Media International and to Screen Scotland. I'd be delighted to give way to Sandish Gilharney.
Sandish Gilharney.
It's full of culture. It is a fantastic city. But on the point that you've made just now on Screen Scotland and all the work in the film industry, I've been approached by multiple people who work across the creative industry and the film industry on TV, and they say jobs are increasingly hard to get, and they're also talking about being unemployed over the Christmas period and then sometimes get picked up. I was wondering what the government will be doing about that.
Thank you. All through the Chair, Cabinet Secretary, can give the time.
I will. I think Sandish Gilharney's point is very timious, given the concerns that have been raised around the commissioning of public service broadcasting in Scotland. And if he has an interest in that, I'd be interested to hear his views, but also his constituents that have raised the concerns that they have, because I share some of the concerns that there are about public service commissioning in relation to productions in Scotland. No doubt we'll be hearing more about that in the weeks and the months ahead. Turning to the budget issue, which I know everybody agrees is key, I'm sure everybody is aware of the Scottish Government's proposals for a draft budget, which will be transformational for the culture sector if passed by the Scottish Parliament in February. The significant uplift has been achieved despite the fiscal challenges facing all portfolios and reflect the value that this government places on culture in Scotland. With a £34 million boost in 2025-26, the budget brings the Scottish Government halfway to reaching its 5-year commitment of at least £100 million more annually for the sector by 2028-29. And I can also confirm that in 26-27, and subject to the normal budget processes, our aim is to deliver a further £20 million increase for the sector. The draft budget, I would, yes.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. While that additional funding is very welcome, I'm sure he is aware that right across Scotland there is real concern around arts venues and arts organisations funded through local authorities who have been warned that their budgets are going to be cut for the coming year. So can he tell us how he squares the announcement he's just made about national funding with the impact that it's having at a local level?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would like to draw Murdo Fraser's attention to the budget proposal, which sees funding for local government go up as well as for the culture sector. So if he cares as much about it as he raises in the Chamber, I look forward to him voting for the government's budget in February. A further £20 million next financial year will enable Creative Scotland to offer regular funding to the largest ever number of organisations across the country, ensuring that even more people can get involved in cultural and creative pursuits and benefit from the increased well-being that comes from self-expression, from creativity and connecting with others through culture. I know how important it is to ensure that this additional funding provides the maximum impact for those working across the sector, and that is why the Scottish Government has committed to review how the sector is supported, including a review of Creative Scotland. This will involve working with partners across the public, the private and the third sectors to find ways to grow the overall funding pot for culture, to diversify funding streams and to support the sector to move forward on a more sustainable footing. I'd like to make some progress if Mr Kerr would allow. As part of this work, it's important that the remit and functions of Creative Scotland, one of the main distributors of public funding for culture, are reviewed to ensure that they continue to meet the needs of the sector going forward. As I announced yesterday, I'm delighted that Dame Sue Bruce has agreed to be the independent chair of the Creative Scotland Review. My officials are already in discussion with Dame Sue about her role, with a view to the Chair publishing recommendations by the end of the summer 2025. The Scottish Government has now also launched a short survey asking for the views of people working across and with an interest in the culture sector about what they value now and what their priority needs will be going forward. This marks the beginning of an ongoing conversation with the culture sector about future requirements which will inform the scope of the sector support review. I'm always interested to hear the views of our cultural and creative workforce in particular about how they can best be supported going forward, and I'd also encourage political parties here in the Chamber and MSPs of all parties also to take part in the survey. In terms of the budget, if the budget bill is passed and the additional funds for culture secured, we will introduce a brand new £4 million Culture and Heritage Capacity Fund from next financial year to provide much-needed tailored support, funding and guidance to help building capacity and resilience across those organisations who need it most. And this is also relevant when considering the opportunities and challenges for festivals. I'm quite sure that there isn't one person in the Chamber today who hasn't attended and enjoyed one of Scotland's local, national or international festivals. There is so much on offer, and 2025 is no exception, with Celtic Connections, for example, one of our most successful winter festivals, set for another internationally acclaimed showcase of talent and diversity this week. An additional £4 million is earmarked to support Scotland's festivals and will include £3 million to significantly increase our Expo Festival Fund to expand its reach beyond festivals in Edinburgh and Glasgow, recognising the importance of festivals right across Scotland in providing opportunities for the wider culture sector. I also understand, I've already given way a number of times to Mr Kerr's colleagues. If he doesn't mind, I'm going to make some progress. I'll see how I do at the end, and then I'll be happy to give way to him, or indeed during the summing up. I also understand that there is much more to be done to support Scotland's festivals to reach their fullest potential, and that's why new funding will also support the activity of the newly established Partnership for Scotland's Festivals. Members of the Partnership have been drawn from across the sector, and I'm already impressed by the constructive, the collaborative and the inclusive approach that the Partnership is taking to develop priority actions that will help to bolster festivals, large and small, across the country. Turning to our national cultural institutions, our national collections, our Centre for Design and our performing companies are hubs for international exchange and cultural excellence. They contribute significant amounts to the economy and support the lifelong learning, the health, the well-being of our communities. And this government recognises the importance of our national cultural institutions, and that's why we are increasing funding to the national collections and our national performing companies, as well as to our National Centre for Design, the V&A, in Dundee. The Scottish Government believes that culture and creative expression enliven our communities, shaping their distinct identities and making them attractive places to live, to work and to visit. And culture and creativity happens every day in communities across Scotland without government support, but to facilitate even greater access to community-driven creative activity locally, we've allocated additional funding to restart the award-winning Culture Collective programme and to expand the Creative Communities programme. Creative, if you'll forgive me, I've already taken a number of interventions, and there's a lot of good news that I want to share with the Chamber. Creative people play a unique and central role in shaping the kind of democratic, diverse, open and innovative society that we live in today, generating ideas and innovation and imagining new futures. People who create have the right to earn a fair living from artistic and cultural professional pursuits and pathways that enable people to develop creative and technical skills in their chosen creative careers, and this should be open to all. In 2021, approximate GVA in the arts, culture and the creative sector was estimated at £4,511 million. That's £4.5 billion, and we know it is also a significant employer, employing an estimated 155,000 people in 2022. The Scottish Government understands that Fair Work First is a key driver for achieving sustainable, inclusive economic growth for the sector, and that's why I established a Fair Work Task Force to support the sector's aspirations in this area, with the aim of developing recommendations for a Fair Work Agreement for Scotland's culture sector by the 1st of June 2025. Of course, cultural and creative participation should be nurtured from a young age, and an uplift in culture funding will enable the Scottish Government's long-standing investment in the nationwide Youth Music Initiative and funding of the world-class Systema Scotland programme to continue. Nurturing a strong current and future cultural workforce is essential to fostering growth in Scotland's creative industries. The Scottish Government will increase funding for Screen Scotland's Successful Production Growth Fund by £2 million in the next financial year to attract international investment and encourage large-scale productions to choose Scotland for shooting, for post-production and for visual effects. This additional support for Scotland's growing film and television industries will provide even more opportunities for skills and talent developing right across a range of sectors. Building on Scotland's wider international reputation for cultural excellence and innovation, and to support the sector in its cultural and creative ambitions overseas, we will also scope the establishment of a support service for cultural export and for exchange. This service will seek to build on current successes by developing connections, providing platforms and supporting cultural and creative organisations to develop the skills and capacity needed to work internationally. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, over the last number of years, I've heard repeated calls from many members here today and from the sector for an increase in Scottish Government funding for culture, and today I've outlined our proposals to do just that. It's now critical that members across the Chamber work together to ensure that this opportunity for transformational change is realised. I very much welcome the ideas from colleagues right across the Chamber about how we collectively better serve and strengthen the sector going forward, and I look forward to hearing positive contributions to this welcome debate. I want to work with all members and all parties to realise our shared ambition for culture in Scotland, and I very much hope that members right across the Chamber will support the planned increase in culture funding through the parliamentary process in the coming weeks.
Thank you. I now call on Murdo Fraser to speak to Move Amendment 1609. 2.3, around 9 minutes. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by very much welcoming the fact we're having a debate on the importance of the culture sector. And on a note of consensus, I agree with a lot of what the Culture Secretary has just said to us about the importance of the cultural sector to Scotland. It has a value in itself as an expression of our national identity and in allowing people's participation in the arts, enriching their life experience and allowing them to develop their talents, both young and old. And we should at this point also recognise the role of many volunteers throughout Scotland who participate in the arts and allow others to participate, without whom many of the arts activities, festivals and events that take place in Scotland simply would not be able to occur. There is also an enormous economic benefit from arts and culture. The creative industries are estimated to be worth around £5.8 billion to Scotland, supporting tens of thousands of jobs. From local events such as Highland Games we see run throughout the summer, to the outstanding quality of our national companies such as Scottish Opera, the arts are there for everyone and help attract visitors from around the globe to contribute to our economic growth as a nation. Now, the Scottish Government, and we've just heard this from the Culture Secretary, has been crowing about the support for the Culture Secretary in the draft Scottish Budget for the coming financial year. The Culture Secretary has talked about a game-changing increase of some £34 million in the budget to support arts and culture, much of that being allocated to the funding body Creative Scotland. These additional funds are, of course, welcome, coming on the back of a very difficult period for culture funding. In the last financial year, there was a cut of nearly £5 million in the budget allocation for arts and culture. So the proposed funding for 25-26 not just replaces that, but does provide a substantial uplift. But while that increased funding is undoubtedly welcome, it only tells part of the story. Giving evidence to this Parliament's Culture Committee last week, the National Galleries of Scotland warned that budget pressures might lead to it having to shut one of its buildings, currently comprising the Scottish National Gallery and the Royal Scottish Academy on the Mound, the Scottish National Portrait Gallery on Queen Street, and the 2 buildings of the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art. And although the Scottish budget for 25-26 gives NGS a 9% rise in funding, the rise in staffing costs, partly driven by the UK Government's increase in employer national insurance, but also partly driven by SNP policies to cut the working week for state employees from 37 to 35 hours, and the prohibition on compulsory redundancies, means that organisation, just one, simply cannot balance the books. Anne Lydon, the NGS Director-General, told the committee that she was having to look at restricting opening hours or even closing one of the sites entirely to save costs. And in the same session of that committee, Historic Environment Scotland said it was having to look at introducing entry fees on some sites which are currently free to visit to address its budget black hole. And it's not just at the national level that we see these financial pressures that I alluded to in my intervention earlier to the Cabinet Secretary. At the weekend, I attended, along with hundreds of other locals, a rally in Perth, where representatives of communities across Perth and Kinross were there to show their support for local libraries under threat of closure. In order to address a funding gap, Culture Perth and Kinross, an arm's-length body wholly funded by SNP-run Perth and Kinross Council, has proposed shutting 5 local libraries. And we heard time and time again from speakers at the rally that these libraries are not just a resource for borrowing books, but they are important hubs for community life. They host a number of activities, and their loss would have a devastating impact, particularly on the young, the elderly and the disadvantaged. And we see this pattern repeated right across Scotland. We see libraries under threat of closures in Moray and Aberdeenshire. We see cultural venues facing closure. Dundee Contemporary Arts, for example, warning its financial future is still unclear, as Dundee City Council seeks to make savings of £15 million. We see museums under pressure. The briefing for this debate from Museum Gallery Scotland gives some examples. Ailith Museum in Perth and Kinross has been closed. In Dundee, the City Council proposing cutting funding to the city's Heritage Trust, which runs the important Verdant Works and RSS Discovery attractions. And in Stirling, uncertainty over funding has led the Stirling Smith Art Gallery Museum, warning they might have to sell off some of their historic artefacts in order to compensate for the lack of investment by the local authority. So, Presiding Officer, this is happening right across Scotland. Another example from Stirling. The Labour administration on the council is looking to scrap music tuition in schools, a vital cultural resource which is an important component in helping deliver well-rounded educational opportunities, particularly for those from disadvantaged backgrounds whose parents might not be able to afford to pay for private tuition. And there are pressures elsewhere too. I raised in this chamber last week the issue of music venues under severe financial pressure due to rising costs, not least, again, the national insurance increases. Music venues were given a 40% business rates relief in the recent budget, a welcome intervention, but this only applies to those with a rateable value up to and including £51,000. According to the Music Venue Trust, this excludes 1/3 of their members, who are therefore put at a competitive disadvantage compared to similar venues south of the border, where that constraint does not apply. So the likes of the Voodoo Rooms in Edinburgh, Nice and Sleazy in Glasgow, or Hootenanny in Inverness will get no financial benefit at a time when they are seeing substantial rising costs. Now, while all this goes on, Presiding Officer, Creative Scotland faces serious questions about its future. And I know my colleague Stephen Kerr will say more about this later in the debate. The decision last year to award the RAIN project over £80,000 in public money is nothing short of a scandal. It transpired that what this money was going towards was the production of effectively a pornographic film featuring live sex. And the explanations from Creative Scotland as to what due diligence was done before the funding award was made have been utterly unconvincing. This is something that should have been properly investigated before any payment of public money was funds, And if that investigation was not done, then clearly the organisation was not carrying out the appropriate checks. And that is not where issues with Creative Scotland begin and end, Presiding Officer, because it was also rocked by the disclosure that a member of staff had urged a shop not to stock gender-critical books, and specifically a publication by the Scottish poet and performer Jenny Lindsay. So although the staff member in question was disciplined, it does raise very serious questions about the culture in operation within the very body that is supposed to be encouraging free speech and expression within a diverse Scotland. So it is welcome that Creative Scotland is now under review by the Scottish Government, and I was interested to hear the announcement about the appointment of Dame Sue Bruce to conduct that review, and we await further details as to the likely timescale and how that review will be conducted. It is not the principle of having an arm's-length art funding body that is in question, but rather whether, given its history of errors, Creative Scotland really is a body fit for purpose, which can have the confidence both of the culture sector and of the wider Scottish population. So, Presiding Officer, while the SNP might crow about the additional funding in the coming budget for culture, the serious problems facing the sector are substantial and they are not going away. And unless we start to address these, and particularly the potential loss of local facilities and activities across Scotland, Scotland's cultural offer, both to our own population and to visitors, will be diminished. These are the points covered in the amendment in my name, Presiding Officer, which I am very pleased to move. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Fraser. I now call on Neil Bibby to speak to and move Amendment 16092.2. Around 7 minutes. Mr Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour welcomes this debate on valuing and supporting Scotland's culture sector. We do so because Scottish Labour have consistently supported the efforts of the sector to receive proper funding. And we recognise the funding crisis that has engulfed cultural organisations and workers for far too long. Indeed, we've used our own debating time in this Parliament to lead calls for supporting the culture sector and for the Scottish Government to do the right thing and to keep their funding promises. Scotland's cultural organisations have faced a perfect storm of crises and a constant cycle of promises followed by cuts. And people will be right to question why we're only now having a debate in government time about support for the culture sector. Presiding Officer, presumably it is because after years of uncertainty and standstill funding since 2018, as Creative Scotland reminded us last week, that the Cabinet Secretary believes the Government finally have something positive to say, or in other words, have stopped adding to the financial problems the sector has been facing. Of course, yes.
Stephen Kerr.
To Neil Bibby for giving way. The reality is that this debate is happening now because if self-congratulation were an Olympic sport, then Angus Robertson would win the gold at every Olympics.
Neil Bibby.
Well, I'll come on to that, but certainly I wouldn't disagree with Mr Kerr on that. Of course we welcome the intention announced in the draft budget to increase the culture budget for the next financial year. It would be churlish not to. We welcome the Government's statement of intent to increase funding back in 2023, demanded the Cabinet Secretary set out a timeline for that delivery, and have been holding the Government's account to keep their funding promises ahead of the draft budget. But there are two important points I want to make. Firstly, the welcome uplift in funding for Scotland's arts and culture budget is a direct result of the new UK Labour Government's record funding settlement to the Scottish Government, with £5.2 billion more coming to Scotland over the next 2 years. The Cabinet Secretary simply cannot argue this is a coincidence. And secondly, I don't think anyone in the culture sector is going to be eternally grateful to the SNP Government just for keeping a promise to provide restorative funding. Anne Lydon, I will.
Michelle Thompson.
I thank him very much for giving way, and of course I too celebrate the increase in funding from the Scottish Government, but I wonder if in his remarks he's going to reflect on the continued and sustained and disproportionate impact of Brexit across our entire arts and culture bodies. I hear this time and time again in my capacity as convener of the CPG for music. It is really, really hurting, and is he prepared to come out in favour of arts organisations because of the damage of Brexit?
Neil Bibby, and I give you the time back.
I wasn't going to mention Brexit in this speech, but since Mr Thompson has raised it, certainly there are issues relating to Brexit that I know the Culture Committee in the Parliament is looking at and trying to improve the Brexit deal we've got and to ensure that there's more visas for touring artists, for example. But in going back to the budget, Anne Lydon, the Director-General of the National Galleries of Scotland, warned the Parliament last week. It is very welcome that additional funding is coming to culture, but it is quite simply too little too late. That is why we find ourselves still in a state of precarity. And because we often hear that the crisis facing the sector is a result of the pandemic, Ms Lydon was also right when she said, "I do not think we are still recovering from COVID, we are recovering from before COVID. Year on year, adequate funding has not been coming in." So there is no need for the Scottish Government or the Cabinet Secretary to pat themselves on the back and say everything is hunky-dory, not just now, sorry. Because they are not the only concerns that exist, there are many more. The Musicians' Union in their briefing for today's debate rightly raised the issue of how money is allocated, saying that increased funding must also drive the delivery of fair work for the creative industries, with funding for the arts providing a key mechanism to achieve this through more robust funding conditionality, and I hope that we make progress towards that, given the Cabinet Secretary's remarks earlier. As Murdo Fraser said, the Music Venues Trust have raised concerns about the lack of support for larger music venues, such as the Voodoo Rooms in the Cabinet Secretary's constituency, and as Murdo Fraser also highlighted, reassurances are needed regarding stronger safeguards after the scandal of public funds wrongly being awarded by Creative Scotland for the sexually explicit Project Rain film. And when it comes to Creative Scotland, an article by Brian Ferguson in yesterday's Scotsman summarised significant concerns that the agency will be forced to spread the jam really thinly when funding decisions are made because the Cabinet Secretaries wish to have the maximum number of artistic organisations to receive the funding. Now, clearly, I think everyone would want to see more organisations supported, but the Government and Creative Scotland need to provide clarity on how the additional budget will affect organisations that have been on standstill funding. For example, the highly successful Beacon Arts Centre in Greenock, who raised 70% of their own income, are just one organisation looking for clarity, and say an uplift in their funding will be crucial to ensuring the survival of the Beacon for future generations and delivering their ambitions, which include creating new posts, expanding their programme and supporting the work of emerging artists. My colleagues Faisal Chowdhury, Colin Smith, Michael Mara and Paul Sweeney will all seek to raise issues from their local areas this afternoon. Presiding Officer, the Culture Committee have recognised that confidence remains low in the sector because of that uncertainty, and trust still needs to be rebuilt. And that trust needs to be rebuilt because of the SNP government's actions. This is a sector that has faced a constant cycle of promises followed by cuts. Because despite the planned increase, cultural organisations cannot be fully certain they will receive the funding because promised funding has previously failed to materialise promptly in previous financial years, including this current one. In December 2022, John Swinney announced a £6.6 million cut to Creative Scotland's budget. In February 2023, after pressure, he reinstated it. But in September 2023, that very same cut was reimposed. We then had more promises 1 month later. But in August 2024, we had Creative Scotland closing the Open Fund due to uncertainty over its funding position from the Scottish Government. Over 2 years of the Scottish Government causing anxiety by doing the hokey-cokey on culture funding, no wonder confidence remains low. But it's not just 2 years, it's 18 years of over-promising and under-delivering from the SNP. We have a culture sector in crisis. Festivals gone, theatres shutting their doors, nearly 100 libraries closed, historic buildings like the Territorial Army building in Paisley being demolished, children and young people not getting the opportunities they deserve. And to sum it all up this week, and just 11 days before Burns Night, we are told by the Scottish Qualifications Authority that interest in our national bard, Robert Burns, is on the wane in our school. The move to downgrade Burns from higher English in our schools is a slight on Scottish culture. This doesn't look like a government that values culture. People who care about Scotland's culture sector shouldn't have to campaign so vociferously and fight to get the funding that was pledged to them, but they had to. And when they're not, then this Scottish Government can say they value and are supporting Scotland's culture sector. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Mr Bibby. I now call on Maggie Chapman. Around 6 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to open this debate for the Scottish Greens. My dad, a professional musician, instilled in his two daughters not just a deep love for a wide range of music, but also a profound appreciation for the power of creativity and artistic expression, how it shapes us as individuals and enriches our communities. I grew up playing lots of different instruments, including some Indigenous Zimbabwean ones, not always very well, I have to say. I'm sorry that I don't now get to make music as often as I would like, or probably should. Because culture is not a luxury. It should never just be an afterthought. It is the beating heart of who we are, the rhythm of our communities, the melody of our shared stories, the brushstroke of our identities. Art, music, dance, theatre, storytelling and heritage are not ornaments on the edges of our lives, but are woven into the fabric of what it means to be human. Culture is how we make sense of the world around us, how we connect with each other, how we dare to dream of better futures. Hamish Henderson said it's the carrying stream, connecting us to the past and the future. It's through culture that we express sorrow, joy, resistance and hope, that we remember our histories and imagine our tomorrows. Our rich cultural heritage in Scotland, rooted in the songs of the North East, the tales of the borders, the murals of our cities, shows us just how deeply culture runs through our veins. Culture also exposes the dynamics of power, class and production. It offers us a means to counter the pervasive nature of capitalist realism and envision alternatives to the oppressive pressure of the productivist economy. So culture must never just be for some of us, the preserve of the privileged and elite. It belongs to all of us. It thrives in the local ceilidh as much as in the grand concert hall. It is alive in the grassroots theatre productions, the community choirs, the graffiti art on our city walls. Take Systema Scotland's Big Noise programme, for example. These incredible projects are transforming lives in communities like Torry in Aberdeen and Douglas in Dundee, communities that often feel forgotten and neglected. Big Noise Torry brings children together through music, giving them not instruments to play, not just instruments to play, but opportunities to grow in confidence, to find their voice, to build friendships. Similarly, Big Noise Douglas empowers young people through the joy of creating music, showing them that they can shape their own futures. These projects are shining examples of how culture can heal, uplift and inspire, and across Scotland for just over £2.5 million a year of Scottish Government money. The Belmont Cinema in Aberdeen is another powerful example of community-driven culture. For years, it was a gathering place for the shared experience of the magic of film, to connect with stories from around the world and from their own streets, to meet friends and strangers, to escape the everyday and find alternative realities. While its doors are currently closed, I commend the passion and work of the Belmont Community Cinema Limited, a group of ordinary folk with a steely determination to bring the Belmont back to life, not just as a building and cinema, but as a space for the community, by the community. A space where people come together, share ideas, learn different skills and celebrate the power of storytelling. And I am grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for his engagement with the Belmont. I hope we will continue to see positive progress on this. Yes.
Liam Kerr. I'm very grateful and I associate myself entirely with her comments about the Belmont. I wonder if the member is as concerned as I am that last week Aberdeen Performing Arts reported a £900,000 drop in revenue alongside rising costs from last year. And does she share my desire that the Cabinet Secretary takes proactive steps to inform himself about this and help, as he's hopefully doing with the Belmont tomorrow?
Maggie Chapman, I'll give you the time back.
Thank you, and I thank Liam Kerr for that intervention. Absolutely, I am concerned about that as well, and I think it points to a broader issue around how culture is so often just seen as an add-on, not something that all of us need to take seriously as intrinsic to who we are as human beings. In Dundee, the Dundee Contemporary Arts, or DCA, is a beacon of creativity and innovation for Scotland. It provides not just a platform for world-class exhibitions, but also a space where people of all ages can explore their own creativity, whether through printmaking, film or digital art. It is a hub of learning, inspiration and connection, reminding us of the vital role that cultural institutions play in enriching our lives and strengthening our communities. That is why the Scottish Greens are committed to championing culture, not just as an optional extra, as I've said, but as an essential part of a fairer, greener society. Culture creates jobs, yes. It enriches our economy, absolutely. And we believe that the culture sector and creative industries can be the backbone of a well-being economy. But its value is far deeper than its monetary worth. Culture nurtures well-being, it fosters understanding, it builds resilience. In a world where divisions are growing and crises abound, culture reminds us of our shared humanity and our capacity for empathy and compassion. Yet, too often, culture is underfunded, undervalued and overlooked. Artists struggle to make a living. Museums and galleries fight for survival. And working-class voices, young voices, diverse voices, are too often drowned out or ignored. So we do welcome the Scottish Government's additional investment in culture, but multi-year funding is essential and really cannot wait, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary will address that in his closing remarks. Because sustained investment now would lead to long-term benefits for our communities, our economy and our climate. Such investment is not an act of charity, but an act of justice. When we fund culture, we fund creativity, connection and community. When we champion heritage, we honour those who came before us and inspire those who come after us. When we celebrate art and music, we celebrate the infinite potential of the human spirit. So let us recognise culture for what it truly is, a lifeline, a compass, a mirror. Let us protect it, nurture it and share it widely, because culture is not just what we do, it is who we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Before calling the next speaker, just to alert the Chamber of the fact we've got a little bit of time in hand, but any interventions would need to be brief. And with that, I call Alex Cole-Hamilton up to 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the motion before us today. It affords a rare opportunity to debate something that seldom captures our attention in this chamber and far less government time. It comes before us, I think, on an auspicious day for the Scottish cultural sector, given the assurances that can now be made about the future of the old Royal High School, a few hundred yards from this building. It has moved a step closer to becoming a new national centre for music, thanks today to the £5 million grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Once considered as the new home for our reconvened Parliament, it looks set to soon be filled with music, sound and activity, a far cry from the clamour, the discordant clamour that we would have graced its walls with these past 25 years had we have taken occupancy. Presiding Officer, one of the last times we debated a motion on culture in this chamber, I spoke about just how important the arts and the cultural sector can be to supporting and unifying us during fractious, turbulent times, a theme I thought captured very well in an eloquent speech there by Maggie Chapman. They can provide a form of refuge, allowing us to shut out the outside world for a little while. They can also deliver a powerful message about the society we live in, or the society we seek to be, making us think about a different perspective on any issue. Theatres, museums, music venues can become a vital part of any community, a hub, the beating heart of those communities, urban or rural, and can play an important role in all of our daily lives. Yet despite how often we talk about the importance of the sector, it often plays second fiddle to other pressing concerns. There are many aspects of public life that do not get the time or the attention they deserve in the debates that take place in this chamber. But it is important we afford time and consideration for culture. Given that this sector makes the contribution this sector makes to our country, our society and its economy, we simply don't give it the airtime that it needs. As an MSP for Edinburgh, I have talked previously in this chamber about the Edinburgh International Festival, the Fringe and others which make our capital in the month of August one of the most vibrant cities on the planet. Millions of visitors descend on the capital each year, generating vital economic benefit. As such, there are many businesses that depend on that vibrancy and that cultural injection that we get each year. It is often seen in large part as the jewel in the crown of Scotland's cultural offering, with many renowned theatre groups, musical acts, dance troupes and comedians coming from all over the world to take part. However, the beauty of the festival has also always been the lesser-known talents, the smaller groups that make up such a large part of the programme, the careers it has launched, not least renowned comedian Tony Slattery, who very sadly died today. As the Executive Director, Francesca Hagee, has previously told me, that the survival of the festival is not inevitable, and it is often these smaller arts groups which sustain it. So we must sustain them. Presiding Officer, those groups, like many other in the sector, have in recent years had to fight, not just for attention, but for funding as well. And I am by no means alone in this chamber in my support for the open letter sent last summer to the Scottish Government, which appealed for the open fund to be reinstated. Whilst I agree with much in the Government's motion today, I do find it slightly galling that it does not acknowledge its own role in the wider uncertainty that the sector has had to contend with over the last few years. There is a spectre of revisionism within its lines. Presiding Officer, culture and the arts sector is one which has undoubtedly been dealt a bad hand by factors beyond anyone's control and by sin of omission by this SNP government. First, of course, there was the pandemic, when too many found themselves excluded from government support programmes. That was followed by the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis. Then the sector had to put up with the Scottish Government messing them around. Money was repeatedly promised, then taken away, leaving people uncertain and feeling betrayed, unable to plan. We saw companies and artists having to change those plans to make time for lengthy last-minute funding applications. It is hard to pay the rent or to hire the people you need for the productions you wish to stage if there is a shadow hanging over the key funding programmes which represent the lifeblood of our cultural offering and our cultural sector here in Scotland. So I hope the Scottish Government does reflect on its actions and recognise those in its closing remarks. I will happily take an intervention from Stephen Kerr.
Briefly, Stephen Kerr. I wonder if Alice Cole-Hamilton would also agree, though, that our culture is being threatened by its lack of presence in our schools. The news that Neil Bibby referred to about the place of Burns on the curriculum, or indeed Shakespeare, or the lack of drama or music, or things that are now called extracurricular, which are actually core to the curriculum of learning. Does he agree that that seedbed of culture is under threat because of the neglect of this government?
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I think Stephen Kerr's point is exceptionally well made, and I think that within each of us there is a fuse linked to a cultural explosion that needs to be lit at some point in our lives, and more often than not, that is caught in schooling. I remember my first interest in theatre, in the words of Shakespeare, in the words of the war poetry that we learned in first and second year of high school, stimulated in me a lifelong love affair with literature and poetry and the arts more generally. So I think his point is exceptionally well made. And it feels like there's always been something of a rift between artists and the body that is there to oversee them in terms of Creative Scotland. There was a very public fallout in 2012, then again in 2018, before the government's recent funding choices put the body in a very difficult position. Many artists will tell you that Creative Scotland isn't always an easy body to deal with, but like it or not, it is effectively the primary incubator for new artistic talent and cultural ventures in this country. So it needs to be up to scratch, capable of operating in the interest of the sector it serves, and open to making changes, adaptive reasoning. So I wished Dame Sue Bruce well with her review. I absolutely do. I think the organisation is in good hands, and I'd really encourage organisations and freelancers to tell her about their interactions with the body and what they need in the future. Presiding Officer, I will close with this. We must always strive to ensure that these organisations are properly funded, the festivals and events which provide so much of the lifeblood to our towns and cities across Scotland. This is not a topic we debate it enough, but I welcome the government's motion today. We will support it, and I thank them for the time they have afforded it. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. I call Evelyn Tweed to be followed by Pam Gosal. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm pleased to contribute to today's debate, and I welcome members' contributions. Arts and culture play a vital role in the lives of people across Scotland. They enrich our communities, support our economy and provide a space for creativity and connection. I fully support the motion which recognises the profound value of culture and its impact on well-being, education and social inclusion. The Scottish Government's commitment to frontline arts and culture funding, with £34 million allocated in the draft budget for 2025-26, is a welcome and much-needed step at a time when cultural investment is being cut in other parts of the UK. Excuse me. The Scottish Government continues to invest in its cultural sector, acknowledging the role of culture in both individual well-being and the economic prosperity of communities. This stark contrast highlights how much we value culture here in Scotland, not as a luxury, but as a core part of who we are. Culture encompasses language, literature, traditions, arts and much more. However, we know that access to culture is not always equitable. Research from the National Trust for Scotland highlights how existing inequalities affect cultural participation. Ensuring access to culture can tackle social isolation, improve mental health and foster a sense of belonging. It also drives economic growth, both at the national level through international festivals that we've spoken about already, such as the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which brings millions to our economy each year, and at the local level through smaller community-based events. The 2020 Cultural Strategy for Scotland recognises these benefits and emphasises empowering communities through cultural participation. This approach is evident in my constituency, where innovative organisations are making a real difference. And we've already heard about Systema Scotland today, and I'm quite happy to talk about Systema Scotland again. Systema Scotland's Big Noise programme in Raploch has transformed lives through music by providing free, high-quality orchestral tuition to children. Big Noise fosters creativity, discipline and confidence. Excuse me. It also provides families and communities together, brings them together, building resilience and pride. Independent evaluations show that Big Noise improves educational attainment, mental health and social skills, demonstrating the lasting impact of cultural investment. As one of the flagship community projects in Scotland, Big Noise is an excellent example of how culture can have a direct, positive impact on some of our most deprived areas, giving young people an opportunity to succeed and realise their potential. In Stirling, the Smith Art Gallery and Museum continues to play a central role in preserving and showcasing local heritage. With a diverse range of exhibitions and outreach programmes, it engages people of all ages to have a deeper connection to Stirling's history and identity. And picking up on Murdo Fraser's points, I am hopeful that funding will be found from the local authority budget that is run by Labour and the Tories to help this amazing organisation. Creative Stirling adds another layer of vibrancy by supporting local artists and working...
Mark Ruskell, briefly.
Can I thank the member for giving way? I'm wondering if she would agree with me that actually it would really help if Stirling Council brought in a visitor levy, because if we had a visitor levy in the city, we would be able to invest in so many of the incredible cultural organisations that we have, from the Smith right the way through to the other bodies that she mentioned.
Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you, and I thank the member for that intervention. Obviously, that is a lever that's open to the Council and probably one that should be considered. Thanks for the intervention. So, as I was saying, Creative Stirling is an amazing local organisation, and its work bridges the gap between grassroots creativity and wider community engagement. This ensures that urban and rural Stirling remains a hub of cultural activity. And I cannot forget the amazing work that all of these organisations did during the pandemic, and it really kept local people going. And Stirling Pride, held for the first time in September, is another example of culture bringing communities together. The event featured music, theatre and art workshops, while businesses and charities hosted inclusive activities. Feedback from the event highlighted demand for more regular LGBTQ+ events across Stirling, particularly in rural areas, and organisers have already responded by securing funding for a rural pride tour, bringing cultural activities like ceilidhs, concerts and film screenings to smaller communities. Rural Scotland is disadvantaged when it comes to access to arts and culture, but by addressing barriers such as cost, accessibility and transport, these events will ensure that cultural opportunities are truly inclusive. Through these events, rural communities from Strathblane to Culin and Falin to Aberfoyle are being connected in new and exciting ways. We must thank volunteers whose contributions to culture in Scotland are invaluable and ensure funding processes are streamlined and easy to navigate to ensure take-up. The investment in arts and culture is an investment in Scotland's people and future. Scotland's approach to cultural investment sets us apart from the rest of the UK, where austerity measures have resulted in cuts to culture. As we look ahead, we must build on our proud legacy of cultural investment, ensuring that Scotland remains a leader in cultural accessibility, inclusion and creativity. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've now exhausted any time we had in time, so members will now have to stick to their speaking time allocation. I call Pam Gossel to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury. Up to 6 minutes. Ms Gossel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before beginning my speech, I would like to thank the Scottish Government for bringing a debate on this important sector. Culture is an integral part of Scotland and extends to music, dance, film, sport, language, to Scottish traditions and much more. Scotland has many diverse festivals, like the fantastic Edinburgh Fringe, which attracts millions of people from around the world. And let's not forget our 550 golf courses, many of which are world famous and attract a lot of people from around the world, as well as bringing the world's best players and tourism. Scotland's culture sector plays a vital role for Scotland's economy. 70,000 jobs across more than 15,000 businesses are supported by the sector, while the total contribution to the Scottish economy is £5 billion. Data from the most recent Scottish Household Survey has found that 76% of adults visited a cultural place in 2023. However, we must not forget that our volunteers and third sector organisations are equally as important in promoting culture. Presiding Officer, it is very important that I use this debate to highlight just some of the great cultural organisations in my region of West Scotland which I have visited. The Men's Shed in Milngavie and Bearsden and in Kirkconnell, which do a fantastic job in helping combat mental health and loneliness, while Creative Spark Theatre Arts in Kirkconnell helps neurodivergent children enjoy theatre. And we must not forget the contribution that Asian cultures bring to Scotland. There are many organisations that help deliver in my region. However, unfortunately, I don't have the time to mention all of them today. I'll mention a couple of them. The Scottish Asian ECTA Group, run by Mrs Cooler, helps widows and single women through advocacy, support and upskilling. And, Presiding Officer, I've been to a lot of these events that this group has held, and it's great to see these women singing, dancing, reciting poems, coming together. Because let's be honest, if there was no funding there, these women couldn't come together and they would be in their homes. The Scottish Indian Mela Cultural Centre has been operating for 34 years. It's another group. It's a Hindu women's group that empowers women through employment and volunteering. These organisations like this are so crucial to our economy, not just socially but culturally as well. But also these are local groups that bring diversity to every area. And as everybody knows, in Scotland we have amazing festivals that a lot of these organisations deliver, from Eid, Vaisakhi, Diwali and much more. So I just wanted to make sure that the Cabinet Secretary speaks about this, that understands how important the Asian culture is and the contribution they bring. However, the SNP government has not always been a friend of culture. While I do welcome recent funding increases announced in the most recent budget, more must be done. The National Galleries of Scotland have said that the £20 million in funding is not enough and would need at least £40 million to meet their needs. I must mention libraries. I know my colleague Murdo mentioned that earlier on as well, as they bring people together to learn all about different cultures. We have seen many libraries shut down across the country, and most affected areas being regional local authorities. Speaking of local authorities, councils are instrumental to promoting culture. However, concerns remain over the funding of local government. As mentioned, Scottish culture attracts visitors from across the world. However, last week, when I met with the Scottish Hospitality Group and the Scottish Tourism Alliance, they expressed concerns over measures taken by this government, such as the failure to pass rates relief to hospitality businesses and the introduction of visitor levy. These measures make Scotland an expensive destination, which could lead potential tourists to choose other destinations. Some representatives even said that businesses have moved from a 7-day to a 3-day working week, as it is unaffordable to operate every day. The SNP government are not the only ones to blame. The increases in national insurance imposed by the UK Labour government have been criticised by this sector. The theatre industry has warned that this increase amounts to nothing less than a huge cut of theatre budgets, while when it comes to Scotland's third sector, this increase is estimated to cost £75 million. I would like to also reiterate what was said by my colleague Murdo Fraser about Creative Scotland. Taxpayer money should never be given towards pornographic films, and therefore I hope Creative Scotland do their homework next time and use their platform in a better way. I was also disappointed to hear that a Creative Scotland staff member tried to prevent a shop from selling books by gender-critical poet Jenny Lindsay. In fact, the Scottish Pen Group has warned that Scotland's worldwide reputation has been jeopardised by the SNP government for limiting freedom of speech and expression. I therefore hope that the measures are put in place to protect free speech and that Creative Scotland offers a platform for everybody. In closing, Presiding Officer.
Ms Gozo, you're ready after your time. Please just bring your mic to close.
In closing, Presiding Officer, the culture sector plays a key role in making Scotland a vibrant place. I look forward to hearing from the Cabinet Secretary on the concerns I have raised.
Thank you, Ms Gozo. We have no time in hand, which has already been made quite clear. I call Faisal Chowdhury. Up to 4 minutes, please, to be followed by Michelle Thompson. Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I will always welcome the opportunity to discuss our arts and culture sector in the Chamber. The benefits of arts and culture to Scotland are numerous: employment, economic growth, tourism, but most importantly, well-being. In recent years, the Scottish Government has failed to recognise the importance of culture. And while facing a perfect storm of crisis, the sector has been forced to mount campaign after campaign due to the actions of the Scottish Government. John Sweeney announcing cuts which were later only partially reversed. The closure and reopening of the Open Fund for Artists. Organisations being left in the dark over the long-term funding settlements. So while I do welcome the uplift in funding for the cultural sector, made possible by the UK Labour Government's record funding settlements for the Scottish Government, the SNP should not be patting themselves on the back for no longer adding to the problem. One budget will not reverse years of mistrust and mismanagement. But this isn't just about money. Culture needs the necessary infrastructure to thrive, like grassroots music venues, without which many of our greatest artists would never have succeeded. But unlike the UK government, the Scottish government will not pass on full rate relief to venues under 1,500 capacity. Limiting to properties with a rateable value of under £51,000. Venues in high-value areas, even those with small capacity, will miss out. So for many, 2025 remains incredibly challenging. The situation in our local authorities, who have been forced to cut culture spending due to Scottish Government underfunding, also remains challenging. If we want to close the 25% gap in attendance at cultural events between the most and least deprived areas, Council must be given the tools to ensure access to culture for all. Local authorities' venues, Motherwell Concert Hall and Branton Theatre in Musselburgh, which play a massive role in increasing local access to culture, were marked for demolition last year due to presence of RAC. Sarah Boyack and I met with the chair of Branton Theatre Trust last week. He told us how important the Branton was to the community, hosting shows, schools, weddings. The importance of these venues our communities should not be understated. The Scottish Government should step up to protect local culture. To conclude, Presiding Officer, the SNP cannot congratulate themselves for merely stemming the bleeding in our cultural sector. The sector needs to move on from fighting for its survival. It needs to see growth and support to thrive. It cannot afford another perfect storm made worse by the SNP government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chowdhury. I now call Michelle Thompson to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Well, I'm pleased with the continued commitment from the Scottish Government and that the will of the Cabinet Secretary has prevailed, despite, I'm sure, many competing pressures. And it's already been stated, but I do think it's worth stating again that the Scottish Government is halfway to reaching its 5-year commitment for that recurring £100 million increase. And, but facts need to be put on the table. I think that the SNP government's draft budget is a clear statement of intent for Scotland's arts and culture sector. 34 million additional for culture, 22 million of that for maintenance projects, uplifts for Screen Scotland, Sistema, Youth Music Initiative, Festivals Expo and the reinstatement of Culture Collective. And I would say to the Cabinet Secretary, he's described it as a foundational change, and I would agree with him. This is really, really important. And I declare more than an interest in arts, and particularly music. And I arguably owe my degree at the now Royal Conservatoire of Scotland to every single future element of my career. Before the value of so-called meta skills became commonly appreciated, I was, even at that early stage, aware of the fact that I was learning so much more than just competence in chosen instruments. I learned how to perform, and that, of course, stands me in good stead for this place. And I can see many other members, indeed here today, who've learned the basic skills of drama as well. Making my living as a jobbing pianist brought the importance of running a small business to the fore, understanding cash flow, legal contracts, my USPs. I learned about sales, and that really, ironically, led me on to a future career in business. I learned about self-discipline and willingly gave up hours of every single day to practice, even through the teenage years when other areas, as you can imagine, held considerable appeal. Nevertheless, I remain fast no matter what I do to my love of music, and I make another shameless plug for new members of our Scottish Parliament. I started this choir so that we could sing with 1,000 voices just in debate. So if you ever want to join a choir, speak to me later. But seriously, the wider economic environment is so critical to ensuring the success of the entire sector. And I make no apology for again bringing up Brexit. At every meeting At every interaction I have with artists or organisations, they tell me about the ongoing and sustained impact in them fundamentally being able to take their excellence, that excellence that represents Scotland, on a global stage. UK Music's annual economic report, delivered just at the end of this year, said Brexit had been a catastrophe for the sector, with artists still seeing fewer invites to perform in the EU and swathes of red tape when playing on the continent. And a much more ambitious plan is needed to make sure the UK keeps pace with intensifying global competition. So the current UK government states it's going for growth, but at the very same time continuing to fail to recognise the damage done by Brexit. And, you know, we have to recognise the UK economy is deeply in trouble when you look at the issues around bond yields and government gilts, and it continues to be a very difficult environment for artists. Another area that I will highlight, which, it's not in the motion today, but I think it's something we need to keep alive to, is the potential impact of generative AI for musicians. This is increasingly a concern I'm hearing more and more, and we see different legislatures around the world trying to make attempts to contain this, but with very limited effects given the scale of movement in this area. The final area I wanted to make some remarks was referencing my constituency of Falkirk East. Kinneil House is a magnificent and truly historic building located in Bo'ness. Once the seat of the Hamilton family, it's been saved from demolition, particularly in 1936, and is now under the care of Historic Environment Scotland. The grounds in which the house are located are a valuable asset for both locals and visitors, and the Kinneil Museum, ably promoted by the Friends of Kinneil, serves as both a comfort station and, more so, a valuable resource for learning more about the cultural contribution of Kinneil House. And this brings me to my main observation. The continuing support of the site overall is vital and needs to involve a multitude of key stakeholders: Historic Environment Scotland, Falkirk Council, of course, and I believe a role for Historic Scotland too. Given the site's national strategic importance and the fact that it represents a totality bigger than any one body, pulling in its heritage significance, its scale, its potential, its local socio-economic need and community value really needs a pulling together of thoughts and minds. And traditionally, in buildings such as this, what we've seen is that individuals, say for example the council doesn't have that totality of sight. So I'm interested in the Cabinet Secretary's reflections that it may actually be an ideal candidate for the Culture and Heritage Fund. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Thompson. I now call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Colin Smith. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Well, can I first of all compliment Michelle Thompson for the superb job she does in filling our lobbies and spaces in this Parliament with music. And she's also right at least about one other thing in her speech, and that was that Labour are responsible for crashing our economy, and we are all going to be worse off for that. But let's also agree, while we're in the spirit of agreeing with one another, that Murdo Fraser was right when he said the creative arts and our historical assets define us. But the Cabinet Secretary must face up to the bitter irony that while he showers himself with praise for restoring the culture budget, libraries, local theatres, our greatest galleries and historic sites are facing the very real threat of closure. The SNP in government is guilty of cultural neglect. Let me turn to the culture review that the Cabinet Secretary... I will, if you're very brief, because I don't think I have any extra time, but I will give way to Keith Brown.
Just on the issue of cultural neglect, will the member acknowledge that according to Equity, between 2018 and 2023, the culture budget reduced by 11% in England, where his party is in control, and increased in Scotland, and also the cuts in local government? That is a responsibility in his area of Stirling Council run by Labour and the Conservatives. Do you not agree?
Well, I don't represent Stirling here, sadly. I represent another part of Scotland, which I'm very proud to do. But I wish we had more time to engage in a proper debate, because I think Keith Brown raises points that are worthy of a proper debate. But let me, with the time I have, if you'll forgive me, move on to talk about the Culture Review that was announced as part of the programme for government. The Culture Committee specifically asked that that review include the governance and transparency of Creative Scotland. Now, if I heard the Cabinet Secretary correctly earlier, he said that Creative Scotland and its processes are part of the review. But let me tell him what Creative Scotland told us last week, and I quote from Anne Langley: the Scottish Government has helpfully been clear that it is a review of purpose and not process. Well, as far as I'm concerned, governance and transparency are an essential part of a review of process. And therefore, I would like the Cabinet Secretary, please, to clarify that. And I'll just quote from Robert Wilson, who's the chair of the board of Creative Scotland. He said, "We have had many discussions with the Cabinet Secretary and government officials. That is our understanding, based on those discussions." So I think the Cabinet Secretary should just clarify, again in his summing up, whether that understanding that Creative Scotland revealed to the committee last week is right or wrong. I think it's wrong, and I'd like to hear him say so. And to clarify that he hasn't changed the remit of the review of Creative Scotland, which receives £80 million of taxpayers' money. And it's important that we review the work, and it's been spelled out very clearly why that should be the case, including the mention of this now infamous case of the porn movie that was funded to the tune of £85,000, but it didn't happen, thankfully, because of other interventions. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could even intervene now. I'd even give him 15 seconds to confirm the review will include all aspects of the workings of Creative Scotland. Does he want to say yes?
Cabinet Secretary.
I have said clearly, and I will happily repeat, that I am not telling Dame Sue Bruce where she should be concentrating her efforts, and I would encourage him and I would encourage other colleagues to take part in review, if they would please take the opportunity to share their views in relation to the review that will be undertaken by Sue Bruce to help steer her in any directions that they feel is appropriate.
Stephen Kerr.
That was a very vague answer again. I think a clear answer about the comprehensive nature of the review is important. Now let me turn to NGS, because that was referenced earlier. Anne Lydon's comments talked about a staffing trap. And I think the SNP members should recognise that the imposition of the policy of the shorter working week is costing NGS alone almost £800,000 and is threatening their ability to be able to open to the hours that they currently open. There's an increase also in national insurance contributions, but what was interesting in the evidence we received last week was that the people giving the evidence kept coming back to the imposition of the shorter working week and other aspects of pay policy that are mandated by the Scottish Government. In fact, Anne Lydon told us that when you add up the shorter working week and national insurance contribution increases, it gets to over £1 million of additional cost. And then she also mentioned the confines that are placed on them, the restrictions, because of a no compulsory redundance policy. She said, "We cannot be as agile or as flexible as we want to be because all the money that we receive goes towards keeping our existing staff profile." Now, because of a restriction on time, let me just mention HES. The HES new chief executive gave evidence to the committee, and she wasn't able to tell us how much it would cost, given the very patchy history of the 300+ properties that HES look after, and the fact they haven't been able to open all of them, and they've been opening and closing them. She wasn't able to tell us how much it would cost to bring all of those valuable assets up to an acceptable standard of safety and accessibility. Now, we've been told, a number of us who are in the committee, by a source in HES, that that's going to cost £800 million. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm to us that he is in talks with HES about these works, and can he confirm that he also has that estimate of at least £800 million to restore these historic sites, vital to our visitor economy? And in conclusion, may I also mention the issue of school music tuition. I remember this campaign from before when the SNP were in power in Stirling. When I was the MP, we had to campaign to save Stirling's music tuition at that time. Let's acknowledge the importance of music tuition in the education of our young people. And this is not the first time there's been a threat to this, not just in Stirling.
Mr Kerr, you will need to conclude.
I will conclude.
Well, please do now.
I conclude by saying this, Presiding Officer, that the deliberate underfunding of local councils, so that ministers like Angus Robertson can come here
Mr.
and
Kerr,
congratulate themselves on spending
Mr.
money.
Kerr. We will now move on to our next speaker, who will be Colin Smith, who will have up to 4 minutes to be followed by Claire Adamson. Mr. Smith.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate and the fact that as a result of the record funding settlement from the UK Government to this Parliament, an extra £5.2 billion over the next 2 years, there is an opportunity to reset the relationship, the damaged relationship between the Scottish Government and the sector. The proposed uplift in the Scottish Government's budget this year can be a first step, but there remains uncertainty over the approach to how that funding will be allocated by Creative Scotland. Many organisations who are not currently regularly funded organisations access funding for ongoing work through the Open Fund with annual applications. It's unclear whether this route will be available in the future, as Creative Scotland seem to hint that multi-year funding may become the only route to support regular or ongoing work. Maybe in his closing comments the Cabinet Secretary can provide some clarity on this, because Creative Scotland haven't, and that remains a concern for any organisation that may be unsuccessful in what is an oversubscribed bid for multi-year funding. Looking to the longer term, I appreciate the Government have announced a review of Creative Scotland and cultural funding. That's also welcome, but this is often referred to as a review into Creative Scotland, and whilst that's an important aspect, it's also important that the review looks at the Government's approach and decisions. The Government needs to take a far more strategic view on what public funds should deliver, what is a sustainable level of cultural funding, and how we provide ongoing certainty and confidence to a sector that feels it has been so badly let down by decisions in recent years. That review also needs to ensure we better recognise the role of culture in delivering creative placemaking in our communities. In November, I had the privilege of co-hosting an event in this Parliament organised by the Stove Network in Dumfries, who have been working with the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency, and how creative placemaking uses the arts and culture as the foundation of community engagement and involvement, and the positive impact that has on health and employment, on well-being, on regeneration. But the current silo model of cultural funding, with that emphasis and focus on performance, often professional, doesn't properly recognise participation. In contrast to, for example, Ireland, I don't think I've got any extra time for this.
There's no extra time. It's up to the member whether they take interventions or not.
Unfortunately, I would love to, but I don't have extra time. But I appreciate that Emma Harper was also co-hosted that event, and she'll have heard the speakers from Ireland who talked about the fact they have specifically additional funding stream for participation in community-based practice. And to be fair, that's something we have when it comes to sport in Scotland, but we don't have when it comes to culture and arts. We also need to really better recognise that wider role of culture in delivering that wellbeing economy and preventing social isolation and improving mental health and regenerating communities by, in my view, better ring-fencing funding streams for that participation. We also need to see more regional equity when it comes to the allocation of funding. Festivals and events are a hugely important part of my region in Dumfries and Galloway, but in recent years we've lost many major festivals. The Wickerman Festival, Electric Fields, the Doonham Festival, and next week the Big Burn Supper Festival returns, but it will do so in a much reduced format, having been cancelled last year as a direct result of the Scottish Government's decision to axe the Winter Festival funding. When new festivals do emerge, such as Music at the Multiverse, in a bid to replace those that have been lost, they really do struggle to get support from government agencies. So, Presiding Officer, in concluding, the cultural offering in Scotland is about more than big international festivals, and that needs to be reflected when it comes to government support for a sector that makes a significant difference to communities in every single part of Scotland, and in particular really helps communities to participate and make a big difference to the area in which they live.
Thank you, Mr Smith. I now call Claire Adamson to be followed by Paul Sweeney. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I was just young enough to see the release of Bill Forsyth's That Sinking Feeling in 1979, and I remember very well being struck by the Glasgow humour and the Scottish attitude in it. And in the final few frames of the film, it's about one of the protagonists standing trying to flog off his sinks piled in front of him, and someone from the Arts Council walks up and offers them a grant. And much in Bill Forsyth's usual style, picking fun at what was the controversy at that time with the Arts Council. And I bring that up by way of demonstrating that arts funding and who gets funding and who doesn't get any has always been a controversial and difficult thing. But what we have to move forward to is confidence that the organisation that is delivering that on behalf of the Scottish Government is meeting the requirements of the sector. And of course, at that time, I was also introduced for the first time to the 784 company, named for 7% of the population owning 84% of the wealth. In 2003, Oxfam estimated that 1% of the population now owns 70% of the wealth. So in that intervening time, what we have seen is much wealth, much growth, but fewer people seeing the benefit of that. And I think that goes to the challenge of where we are in our arts sector. When budgets are squeezed, when situations are difficult, it becomes even more difficult when the wealth of the nation is so inequitable. Scotland's artists innovate and entertain us. And they challenge us, and they are the custodians of our culture. And while I'm speaking today as MSP for Motherwell and Wishaw, I do chair the SEAC committee, or convene the SEAC committee, I should say, and I am very conscious that we are in the middle of taking our evidence and have not yet reached a conclusion on the budget. So I'll try to be factual in what we've learned so far. I think that we also have to consider the pandemic. It's been mentioned by a few of my colleagues in the Chamber this afternoon, but few of us could have imagined lockdown without reading a book, a poem, watching TV, honing or learning a new craft, or listening to music, or even picking up an instrument, perhaps for the first time. An artistic endeavour is the lifeblood. Music and culture run through our communities like a vibrant thread in the representative tartans. And without those threads, it would be a much duller and boring tartan indeed. They inspire us, and we are inextricably bound by culture internationally and here in Scotland. And there are many great inequities in the world, but culture can be a great leveller. And yes, there are many people who struggle to access it, and that's what we must be focused on going forward. Equity of access, and ensure as many people as possible can participate in our culture. Last week, we took evidence from stakeholders, including Creative Scotland, National Galleries, Wigton Festival, Federation of Scottish Theatre and Culture Counts. These organisations are at the forefront of Scotland's culture and are considering the impact of the proposed Scottish budget. Organisations across the culture sector have warmly welcomed the Scottish Government's proposed £34 million increase to frontline culture funding. And the difference with funding elsewhere in the UK has also been highlighted by colleagues in the Chamber this afternoon. Fiona Sturgeon-Shea of the Federation of Scottish Theatre and Culture Counts spoke of developing the culture sector for the common good. And she was especially encouraged by the allocation of an additional £20 million to Creative Scotland's multi-year programme funding, which has been mentioned again as such an important development in their culture sector in Scotland. We also heard from Adrian Turpin of the Wigton Festival Company, who echoed these sentiments, but also talked about the difficulty in accessing culture in rural areas. And I think we have to consider this in more detail. And I think back to last week's debate on the National Performance Framework, and the debate that we saw that we can be quite siloed ourselves in this Parliament. When we... Yes, Will, thank you.
Emma Harper.
Thank you. I really appreciate Claire Adamson for giving way, and it's kind of on the point about rural, and a lot of members have talked about Glasgow and Edinburgh, so Central Belt, and I would just, as a keen Burnsian herself, I would just ask if Claire Adamson welcomes the fact that the Big Burns Supper is going ahead this year, and we've got entertainment such as Eddie Reader, Wet, 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 and an underwater Burns Supper taking place in Dumfries in the next week.
Yes, I would absolutely welcome that, and I hope to be able to maybe get down for a visit to see some of the events. It's really important that we consider how siloed we can be in our thinking, because if we really are to embrace the wellbeing economy, we have to look at culture and its role in all of these issues, in rural issues, in health issues, in social security issues, in housing issues, as we build local communities. Audiences are returning, but in many cases they're still down from pre-COVID levels. Ongoing issues with the cost of living means it's difficult for many people to make the choice to support the arts. Striking that balance between raising revenues and supporting artists and maintaining cultural output that is accessible across different communities is a critical challenge going forward. And that becomes more acute when
Ms Adamson, you will need to conclude.
Sorry, I will conclude there. Just by saying, Labour's tax on jobs isn't helping the situation for a lot of our cultural organisations.
Thank you, Ms Adamson. I now call Paul Sweeney. Up to 4 minutes, to be followed by Keith Brown. Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I was struck by what the member for Motherwell and Wishaw mentioned, that sinking feeling by Bill Forsyth. One of the films that I remember watching with my mum as a kid, and it was quite striking because we used to sit and look at all the places we recognised in our city growing up, and it then reminded me of the late Alistair Gray's line from Lanark about Glasgow being a magnificent city, but why do we hardly ever notice that? Because no one imagines living there, because so many other cities around the world are projected to a global population in imagination through books, films, music, in a way which perhaps Glasgow isn't. To the same degree, and that's perhaps why we don't recognise the magnificence of the culture that surrounds us every day. And I think that so often in Scotland we do not fully appreciate the extent of our cultural inheritance from previous generations in particular, which is why I've been so taken by this agenda of trying to safeguard the City of Glasgow's built environment. And I say that as a declaring an interest, I suppose, as a member or trustee of the Glasgow City Heritage Trust. Because it feels like a constant war of attrition, Deputy Presiding Officer, to safeguard our cultural inheritance in Glasgow, whether it's the £7 million of cuts that the museum service has had to make because it's 80% dependent on council funding, which is under continued pressure every year, leaving just one curator to look after over 1 billion objects in the museum's collections. The absurdity of that situation when the National Museums in Edinburgh are given far greater resources. No one could say that Kelvin Grove is anything other than a museum of international standing. Similarly, we see those pressures play out with the great Macintosh inheritance, which is nothing short of a globally significant architectural inheritance. I obviously mentioned to the Cabinet Secretary the issue with the ongoing impasse at the Glasgow School of Art Macintosh building. Hopefully we can see progress this year, but nonetheless we are seeing Glasgow City Council putting Macintosh's Martyrs School up for sale. Its fate to be determined. Similarly, continuing impasse over the future of the Lighthouse, the former Glasgow Herald building, which was opened as Scotland's Centre for Architecture and Design in 1999. It's been closed since the pandemic. And also the ongoing threat to our built environment. So many charitable and cultural organisations are custodians of some of our amazing built heritage. The member for Edinburgh Western mentioned, of course, the Royal House School in Edinburgh, which is finally seeing progress, which is great. But we could take, for example, the Govan Hill Baths in the south side of Glasgow, which has been a long-running community campaign to revive that building. We had made progress with capital funding in recent years, but because of the escalation in building material costs has then fallen into a deficit and is stymied. But also the pressure on the funding from the council has meant that they've changed their policy on business rates, non-domestic rates. So they have recently, in the last financial year, removed the exemption for listed buildings to be given rates relief. Now, on one hand, that could be a positive thing because many private interests own listed buildings and don't preserve them and don't do anything with them, so it creates an incentive to actually do something with them. But many cultural organisations that are running on a shoestring are then caught up in that. So I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to look at the application of non-domestic rates across Scotland, particularly in relation to non-profit organisations, and how we can provide that degree of exemption. I would also urge the Cabinet Secretary to consider what more he could do in his office to preserve our built environment. I recently have been working with my colleague Neil Bibby in Paisley on trying to save the Territorial Army drill hall there, which is under imminent threat of demolition. The Council have felt that they can't take on the risk of serving an urgent works notice because it would leave a financial liability for the Council, yet they have the power within the 1997 Act to recover the costs from the owner, yet are not minded to do so. The Cabinet Secretary could directly intervene and serve the urgent works notice. I wonder if he could look at that case and perhaps how he could more actively use those powers in the 1997 Act to safeguard more of our built heritage.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. And I call our last speaker in the open debate, Keith Brown. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I think it's very worthwhile to say that there is a degree of consensus, I think, in relation to the fact that the Scottish Government has proposed a £50 million increase in funding in terms of the historic investment in our cultural landscape. And that is a significant step towards the Government's target of raising funding by £100 million by 2028 to 29. And that demonstrates, I think, the commitment of the Scottish Government to supporting culture during these challenging times. And I agree with other speakers, in particular Maggie Chapman and Evelyn Tweed, about the value of culture for all of us. I think Maggie Chapman used the phrase, it helps us, reminds us of the shared humanity of the country in which we live. I think it's a very important point. However, I think it's also true to say that a lot of references to the past have been made. And I do remember the Royal High School's been mentioned a couple of times. When I was a kid, we used to get the bus there on a Monday morning to go in the swimming pool, which actually was the future chamber of the proposed Scottish Assembly at the time. And it's sad to see the way in which that has not developed over the years. Very interesting, of course, it was reclaimed by the council in Edinburgh for, I think, £1, because it was actually under a pre-emption clause, their right to reclaim that after the war when it had been taken over by the government. Also, to hear Claire Adamson, our convener on the committee, talk about the 784 company, I suppose that's been a bit older than Claire Adamson. I remember the Chivy at the Stag and the Black Oil, and the impact that had in Scotland, the relevance it had, and the relevance, I would say, that it still has to Scotland's situation. And interestingly, I've seen a revised version of that, I think last year, in the Royal Lyceum, a fantastic production there as well. But whilst we're looking in the past, I think there's a couple of points that really have to be made. So we heard from Neil Bibby and others who refused to take my intervention, the idea that this was revisionism on the part of the Cabinet Secretary to talk about the new funding that was now being available, and it ignored the past. Well, let's just take a wee look at the past. Because Equity produced a report which says between 2018 and 2023, funding for the arts and culture in England fell by 11%, in Northern Ireland by 16%, in Labour-run Wales by 30%. Funding for the culture in Wales, run by Labour, fell by 30%, whereas in Scotland it increased. And you would never have guessed that from the contributions of Neil Bibby. I think the other thing which really does undermine any credibility which Labour would have is the fact that whenever you see these days a Labour minister on TV, they will start the interview by saying about the horrendous record that they have had to inherit from the Tories. And I've got a lot of sympathy with that. They will pretend endlessly it had no effect in Scotland. It obviously undermined all that they did in Wales, including all the cuts to local government there, but it didn't have any effect in Scotland. It was entirely down to the SNP, and that gives them no credibility whatsoever. As is the case when they refuse to say, in all the demands for more money, how much more money they're talking about and where it's going to come from. Are they for once going to have the gall to propose an amendment to the budget advocating more money for culture? I am guessing no. As they've never done over the years that we've been here. So really, if they want some more credibility in this, they really have to acknowledge the effect of 14 years of austerity. And I also agree about the other effects, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's increased employee costs, all sorts of things that have had an impact on the cultural sector, as it's had on many sectors. But Michelle Thompson is right. One of the biggest impacts, and the committee has heard this, has been Brexit. The absolute demolition of the careers of many musicians who can no longer tour Europe because of the costs and restrictions involved, many of whom now go under an Irish banner because Irish are willing to help us do that. Let's at least acknowledge the hugely damaging impact of Brexit in the culture sector in Scotland. And if you don't acknowledge these things, the effect of 14 years of austerity, the effect of Brexit, you have no credibility in terms of talking about the cultural sector. And as a member of the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs Committee, which has recently reviewed the budget, I can confirm the committee's discussions have highlighted the ongoing recovery of cultural organisations post-pandemic. And I'm not trying to minimise the challenges which they still face. I would also say, as somebody that grew up in Edinburgh for 30-odd years, spent in Edinburgh, I'm very much a supporter of all the festivals. But we have to remember there are other parts of Scotland too, and that doesn't mean just Glasgow. There are other parts that are neither Glasgow nor Edinburgh, neither Highlands nor Lowlands. My area is Stirling and Clackmannanshire. and we have to make sure that we have a cultural presence here as well. And one of the ones that was not mentioned in relation to Stirling, which is in my constituency, of course, is the McRobert Arts Centre, an absolutely invaluable cultural asset, as is, of course, the Smith Art Gallery Museum in Evelyn Tweed's sector. And, of course, if you doubt their cultural assets, think about the oldest football in the world, which was discovered there and went to the World Cup in Hamburg a few years ago and was piped on at the very first match, even though Scotland were not represented, unfortunately, in that World Cup. So I think there's no doubt that we all have cultural assets within our communities, and I think many of them will be very pleased about the Government's announced proposed increase in the budget. And they will also understand, even if some people in this chamber don't, that the previous situation in terms of funding for culture is something where the UK Government's cuts, the austerity cuts, have had a profound impact over many years. And yet, despite that, the Scottish Government has maintained increases, sometimes minimal increase, I acknowledge that, in those budgets. So I think there's a lot to be very pleased about in this budget. I hope the committee will finish its work in terms of scrutinising the Scottish Government's proposals. And I hope that the other people in this chamber who say they profess to support culture and the arts will support the Scottish Government's budget, which proposes such a large increase. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Brown. We will now move to closing speeches. I call on Mark Ruskell to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think this afternoon's been perhaps a rare opportunity to take the temperature of the health of the culture sector in this post-Brexit, post-COVID world. And I hope that the budget that's being proposed by the Scottish Government does mark the start of the end of austerity that the culture sector has been suffering with over a number of years. So, as Greens, we welcome the uplift of £34 million that's in the draft budget this year, and also the commitment to £20 million in the next year. And I hope this marks the start of Creative Scotland offering meaningful multi-year funding to organisations who've been struggling for years. Organisations who just continually have to reinvent themselves in order to try and secure core funding when they actually need to be getting on with delivering the creative projects that they are going to be so successful in delivering if only they could get that money. And Alex Cole-Hamilton talked about the kind of shadow of uncertainty that's hung over many artists and many projects throughout those long years of austerity and throughout the post-COVID funding environment. We need to restore confidence in the sector. I think, Neil Bibby characterised it as a bit of a hokey-cokey approach to funding, where funding was committed to and then withdrawn and then brought back in again. That has been unhelpful. So I really hope that the budget that's being proposed this year will start to build that kind of confidence back again. Also welcome the Creative Scotland review to be led by Dame Sue Bruce. And I really hope that that review will be broad-ranging. I hope that it will look to get culture out of the silo that it's sometimes seen in. Because as Maggie Chapman said, culture and culture projects have the capacity, the power to heal, to uplift and to inspire. When I think about the Christie Commission and that whole agenda around preventative spend, we're decades on from that now, and we've yet to make really significant progress on areas like mental health and on education and on community development and restoration of our communities. But when we look at organisations like Systema Scotland, as Evelyn Tweed has spoken passionately about, DCA, Maggie Chapman talked about in Dundee, the Stove Network mentioned by Colin Smith, and Creative Stirling as well, which has been an incredible driver of innovation throughout the pandemic. These are all organisations that create communities. They are the driving, beating heart of our communities, and they support the most vulnerable people, and they uplift them. So, really important that this funding is felt by those organisations who often survive on relatively small amounts of money but do incredible work. And I'm heartened to hear that the Culture Collective, the work of the Culture Collective, will be brought back, because under that umbrella there are some really innovative organisations, and from that there's going to be a real wellspring of innovation, and we can learn a lot from those networks of community cultural organisations. I also welcome that the Government has announced a 40% relief for hospitality venues. That's particularly welcome when we look at the plight of grassroots music venues. There is an issue there around the threshold of £51,000, because clearly there are a small number of city centre venues which will not benefit from that rates relief. But I think set against a crisis where across the UK we've seen one grassroots music venue shut every single week last year, we need to start to find ways to support this sector. And I think, one way to do that would be through looking at application of a visitor levy. Another aspect, which I know the Cabinet Secretary has spoken about with myself and Patrick Harvey on a number of occasions, would be the introduction of a ticket levy on a national basis. If you look at Taylor Swift's, I don't think I've got time, but if you look at Taylor Swift's Eras tour last year, just a £1 levy on each ticket of those 3 concerts would have raised £200,000 for our grassroots music venues. And of course, it's the grassroots music venues that create the big stars of the future. And I think about, we've talked a bit about Stirling. I think about actually the venue at the toll booth in Stirling. There's a wee space in the toll booth that hosts an audience of just 30 people. And that's great for new and emerging artists who've perhaps never done a gig before. But they need that small, intimate venue in order to ply their trade and to get their confidence in order to go on and achieve great things. So, I welcome the fact that Glasgow Green councillors have been successful in getting cross-party support in Glasgow for the introduction of a music venue levy, a stadium levy for council-controlled venues, and I look forward to progress on that. I'd like to just turn briefly to the plight of councils. Amodo Fraser mentioned the protest that we were both at actually on Saturday. We both spoke at it. Rural communities wanting to stop the cuts of their rural libraries. And we have to recognise that many of these communities, many of these libraries are also co-located with arts venues as well. And they're often the last free, warm, open facilities within communities that are genuinely accessible. And that once they're gone, once these buildings are gone, they're gone. But I think the Cabinet Secretary does need to look at the reliance that councils have on arm's-length companies. That's certainly for the delivery of leisure and cultural services. That's certainly been the case in Perth and Kinross. There's been an over-reliance on council funding through Culture Perth and Kinross. Perth and Kinross Council have not adequately funded the fair pay policies that needed to be passed on to library staff, and as a result, that organisation, Culture Perth and Kinross, is in a dire financial state. I do think in that case, the council need to properly fund culture CPK. They need to recognise they've had probably a better funding settlement coming from the Scottish Government. They've got the opportunity to raise council tax and a visitor levy. So they should be taking those rural library closures off the table.
You will need to conclude, Mr.
Thank you. I was going to go on to mention what Paul Sweeney mentioned in relation to arm's-length companies in Glasgow Life, but I'll leave it there, Presiding Officer. And just to say that, we need to restore this confidence. I think this budget could be the first step towards that, but there's still work to do.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr Ruskell. I now call on Mike O'Mara to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A very typically wide-ranging debate. It's incredibly difficult to represent the breadth of the so many streams and threads of our national culture and the many interests that members hold and those on behalf of their constituents. Art does offer, in I think Maggie Chapman's frame, the opportunity to imagine alternatives. It's certainly part of its role as a provocation to all of us, and there's been a little bit of that today. But it also offers escapism and enjoyment. A Friday night pint watching a band, just as important and as much part of our national culture. And Claire Adamson, I think, was very right to point out that the funding of the arts is always and rightly controversial and difficult. That's certainly part, and since the devolution, the advent of devolution in 1999, there has been several iterations of this, the challenge. So the tension in subsidising non-conformity, frankly, in terms of the way that our arts are undertaken. Where I do find some difficulty in Claire Adamson's contribution is that the desire to spend the £5.2 billion without ever realising, as these benches always do, the means by which it is raised. And of course, Mr Kerr says here, I think he said exactly the same himself, frankly, the issue of national insurance contributions, difficult for many organisations, I understand that. But without raising the money, you don't get to spend it. And that is core to the challenge of how all of this works. But the idea of that investment, the idea of the investment, the £5.2 billion, which has enabled, we all hope, the end to the chaos of the promise, the broken promise, the cycle that is actually illustrated and characterised the Cabinet Secretary's tenure in office, whether for his own cause or whether the situation he finds himself, not for the moment, Ms Thompson, if you allow me to progress a little. It's part of the challenge, I think, that many organisations have found to understand what on earth is happening, from the promises that are made one month and then broken the next, and finding some kind of certainty in it. We would like to see that emerge through the Creative Scotland review, but I think Mr Kerr rightly pointed out today the lack of clarity in terms of reference of that review. And it would be good, I have to say, Cabinet Secretary, to find a little bit more clarity in his closing remarks on that basis, because this disarray does have very significant consequences, and many members have illustrated those on their local organisations, and I will do similarly. Murdo Fraser, I think, rightly referenced the issue about the relationship between central government funding and local government funding, both absolutely critical to arts organisations. And in Dundee, whether it be the DCA or the Dundee Rep, the Dundee Heritage Trust, which runs Verdant Works and Discovery Point and the fabulous RRS Discovery, are all in a very precarious situation. And it's partly about the lack of clarity that comes from the national situation, no idea about when the money might arrive and how much that might be, given the chaos of recent years. But it's also, Presiding Officer, about the amount of money that might be available through local government and the complete lack of certainty and, frankly, proposed cuts to budgets that are on the table at the moment. So I wrote to the Cabinet Secretary on this very issue, and I had a warm bath of a letter, I have to say, back. Very nice words about the investment, but absolutely no answer to the question that I asked. When will that money be confirmed? When will there be clarity for these organisations so that they can pay staff, so that they know when their doors will actually be open? And that's absolutely critical, because it does impact on our economy. And I do believe that members are right to reference the challenges of Brexit. Fully recognise both Keith Brown and Michelle Thompson set out that case very well, the real challenges that present. And Neil Bibby responded to that regarding touring artists and the challenges they are to actually make a living in those kind of contexts. There is no doubt that Brexit has a very significant negative impact on our cultural sector and the viability. And you have to listen to touring bands in particular to hear that point made very clearly. Neil Bibby also touched on the fair work and the calls from the Musicians' Union to make sure that funding is incumbent on that basis. We all want to hear tills ringing, we want to see the turnstiles clicking, and we want to see the footfall rising. It's absolutely critical to our towns and our cities. Keith Brown also talked about John McGrath's The Cheviot, The Stag and the Black Oil and the 784 company. I would point to him that the most recent production of that was from the Dundee Rep, I believe, in 2016. Maybe he's seen a more recent production than that. It certainly appeared at the Lyceum back then. It was the first national tour that took place in over 20 years. Now, there might be some points in that, I think, fairly nationalist production that he and I would disagree on, but a fine piece of theatre it is, a provocation, and rightly so. But that is a company, Dundee Rep, which is now under direct threat, making brilliant, provocative theatre not everybody agrees with, and that's the point of it. Which brings me to Robert Burns and the real dismay, frankly, that I felt seeing the headlines about the removal of Burns from a standalone assessment curriculum in our national schools. This is, frankly, our national poet. And I think the SNP would do well to reflect upon if a nationalist party isn't protecting the nationalist poet, what on earth are they for? No, thank you. I'm coming to a close. Robert Burns did more than any other single figure in our history to protect our national culture and our language, Presiding Officer. The Kilmarnock edition was carried by Scots across the world. It came out in 1891. It was a Rosetta Stone between the rural and the urban, the change in our national culture at the fin de siècle of the end of the 19th century. He cannot be lost. His work cannot be lost to the vagaries of fashion. What will the Cabinet Secretary do about it?
Thank you, Mr Mara. And I now call on Alexander Stewart to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to close this debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives, and I will be supporting the amendment in Murdo Fraser's name. Scotland can be proud of the cultural footprint it leaves on the world stage.
And I have no doubt that all sides of this chamber will agree on the importance that Scotland's culture sector has. Indeed, we've heard today about the multi-billion-pound value the sector has and the tens of thousands of jobs it supports. But in reality, the value that the culture sector is sometimes much more than the numbers that we hear, Presiding Officer. Therefore, I welcome the opportunity that we've had today to have this debate and to hear many of the speeches that have taken place. But while Scotland's sector is, cultural sector is something that should be celebrated, we know that it is facing a number of ongoing challenges, Presiding Officer. And I've spoken in the past about the closure of many important historical sites across Scotland, and there are still sites in Scotland that are at risk. Scotland's buildings tell us more important stories about Scotland's culture, and it's vitally important that people get the opportunity to see them, and they shouldn't be wasted on long-term closures. So I call once again on my party, has said in the past, that we want to see many more of these institutions and buildings reopened. And to that end, I welcome Historic Environment Scotland has begun to work on its work on Dunfermline Abbey, and this week with the potential safeguards that are putting in place. Presiding Officer, these challenges are facing culture sectors, indeed across the public sector. We've heard today about libraries. Now, libraries are a vital link within communities, and we've heard about the difficulties in Perth and Kinross, and also in Stirling about potential closures. And the initiatives that we've seen and the innovation that we've talked about with the Public Library Improvement Fund are welcome, but they do not go far enough in managing the challenges that we have. And we've heard today about local government challenges where councils are still being asked to do more with less, and they have to make choices. Last week I raised an issue in the Chamber about music services that are happening across Scotland. In particular, I'm a lifelong campaigner for music and the arts, and I'm here today to once again continue to do that. We've heard today about the Stirling Music Services and the £250,000 that is being proposed. And I have certainly, and I will continue to stand up for that and challenge individuals within the council to make sure that that does not happen, because we cannot see the removal of that. Fewer opportunities for young people to sit exams, less opportunities to participate in choirs, bands and youth orchestras. That's not the way forward. A petition that we've already seen has got thousands of signatures in a matter of days on Save Our Children's Music. And we've also had individuals from John Lunn, who was, as you know, is a supporter, and he is the composer of Downton Abbey. He talked about his life in Bridge of Allen and how he credited much of his success to Stirling's Council's music services. So we have to listen to these individuals who tell us what's actually happening on the ground. I'm proud to advocate for what's taking place. And we've also heard today about the skills and the big noise that happen in Stirling within my own region, and they're vitally important. But we cannot take away, Presiding Officer, from the difficulties that we've seen over the last 18 years of this SNP government. They've done and they've continued to support the sector, but not enough. Not enough's been done over the timescales, and it's far too little and it's far too late. The Cabinet Secretary, when he spoke, talked about the value of culture. And yes, there's a value of culture, and community culture is vitally important, but that creative industry requires to be supported. And there has been a difficult time, Cabinet Secretary, and you acknowledge that as well, about trust and confidence within the sector. And that trust and confidence has taken some dents during your own time as a Cabinet Secretary. So I look forward to hearing what will happen when the future of Creative Scotland and the reviews that come forward. Murdo Fraser, in his opening, talked about the relationship between national and local government. That's vitally important to support the sector, to give the sector what it wants. We also all welcome the uplift, but the budget pressures that face facilities, that face pay awards, the cutting of services, libraries, art venues, spaces, all are important. And the national insurance contribution from the new Westminster government has a massive impact on the sector. Neil Bibby spoke about the cultural sector and he welcomed that it was too little and too late for the money, and the hokey-cokey that has taken place between the budgets going back and forward. They're all vitally important in this process. Alex Cole-Hamilton talked about the vital support and the deserved and the festivals that happen within Edinburgh and the flagships that take there. But at the same time, these organisations have a shadow hanging over them, and it's right to acknowledge that, Mr Cole-Hamilton. Pam Gossel talked about the creative side of life and the volunteers and people who play the role in music, art, dance and theatre, and the impact of the Asian community within all of that, about how they are so diverse and how they will prosper and how they will support and festivals like Diwali and Eve are vitally important. Stephen Kerr once again gave a very robust speech about his cultural insight into what's taking place and talked about governance and transparency of Creative Scotland. These have to be acknowledged, that there's still a problem with that. And once again, the pay awards, the reduction in working weeks, the national insurance contribution, save music tuition, all of that we've heard across the piece. So as I conclude, Presiding Officer, Scotland's culture is steeped in creativity. Our art, our music are a credit to us and a credit to the nation. I hope that as we go forward, the Scottish Government can continue to ensure that the culture sector provides and is provided with the support it deserves, the support it needs. But we have to acknowledge that, as I say, much more needs to be done to secure the future. Arts, music, culture matter. Trust and confidence also matter in the sector. And as I say, at the moment, we still have a long way to go to achieve that, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. And I now call on Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson to wind up the debate on behalf of the Scottish Government. And if you take us to decision time, Cabinet Secretary, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'd first like to thank members from all parties for their very engaging and thoughtful contributions today. And once again, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here because we are all passionate supporters of culture, and we all value the artists, the creative producers, the cultural workers and the organisations and the volunteers who help to make Scotland the society that it is today and to generate so much for our local and our national economies as well as our cultural life. This is clear from the varied experiences of culture that we've heard about today from colleagues across the Chamber. I'm going to try and reflect on as many as I can. Forgive me if I have been unable to touch on all the points that have been raised. Murdo Fraser began really well by talking about the artistic and economic benefits, but then managed to call for more culture spending, but failed to confirm that he'll vote against this in the budget vote later this year. From Neil Bibby, we heard a warm welcome for increased culture spending. In fact, he called for the Scottish Government to raise spending on culture by £20 million, only days before the Scottish Government announced that we intend to raise it by £34 million. And he failed to confirm that he's going to abstain when it comes to the vote on increasing culture spending. Failed to acknowledge that Labour is actually cutting revenue funding when it's in office elsewhere in the UK, a point that was raised correctly by Keith Brown when he talked about the total lack of credibility from both the Conservative and the Labour parties on an issue where we hear speech after speech from colleagues valuing the importance of culture, calling for the financial support, and on the one hand are going to vote actually against it or are going to abstain. In contrast, we heard from Maggie Chapman, quite rightly, underlining the importance, the transformative impact of the arts with the likes of the Big Noise project. And I think it was really good to have that put on the record. And she also underlined, and this was a point that Mark Ruskell made, about the essential nature of multi-annual year funding for cultural organisations. Michael Mara needed to write to me to find out when Creative Scotland is making announcements on multi-annual year funding. I can point to their website, Mr Mara, which will tell you the announcement will be made before the end of this month, and we should all look forward to that, because I do think that I think there is consensus across the parties that multi-annual year funding is really, really important. If he keeps it brief, I'll try and reply.
Michael Mara. I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary giving way. We do not recognise that these institutions in Dundee are in significant financial distress, and they are awaiting clarity both on his budget but also on the local government budget. As Cabinet Secretary for Culture, what is his response to the situation they find themselves in?
Secretary.
I'm sorry he's not caught up with the news, because I was delighted to meet with the convener of the City of Dundee Council and local parliamentarians last week to talk about the challenges that exist in Dundee. And as I have acknowledged in previous question times in this chamber, one of the big challenges in recent years has been to support and make sure that important cultural organisations are not going to the wall. And we've worked very hard to do that. I gave a commitment to colleagues in Dundee that I would be doing the same, but I invest a lot of hope in what we're about to hear in terms of the multi-year funding announcements. Foundational is how I have called it. I believe it to be so, and if there are any parts of the cultural firmament that are not covered by multi-annual year funding, it's going to be a priority to make sure that they are on a firm footing as well. But in general, I would like to underscore the fact that I think there is cross-party agreement for multi-year funding, and that announcement is going to be imminent. To Alex Cole-Hamilton, he talked about the importance of culture and funding, as have others. And to that end, hopefully he and his colleagues will follow the logic of the argument, unlike the other parties, and actually vote for increasing culture funding in the budget, as well as the motion before us today. To other colleagues, we heard from Evelyn Tweed about the culture sector in Stirling, from Pam Gosel on the importance of the Asian cultural contribution as a part of our national life, and she's absolutely right. I concur with her entirely. We heard from Faisal Chowdhury, from Michelle Thompson, who, as she regularly does, underlined the negative impact of Brexit, and we should never forget that. We heard from Stephen Kerr, from Colin Smith, from Claire Adamson, from Paul Sweeney, and on the built environment, I always listen very closely to the points that he makes, and to Michael Mara. Well, he now knows the answer to the question that he didn't have before. I would commend him to use the internet to find these things out, which are in the public realm already. And to Alexander Stewart, who has a fine voice, if not the finest of arguments, as a member of the Parliamentary, choir. I encourage him to rebel against his party line and to vote for the increase in culture funding, which I think we all agree is necessary. Now, it is clear that we're in agreement that now more than ever we have to make sure that every pound of public funding for culture is wisely invested for maximum sectoral impact, and that support available from across the public, the private, the third sectors is also enhanced where possible, so that together we can strengthen culture, create the conditions for culture to thrive, one of the central ambitions set out in a culture strategy for Scotland. To fully harness this potential, it's clear that we need to continue to engage closely with our culture sector and collaborate with strategic decision makers across central and local government, using all the lessons, the levers, the convening power that we can bring to the table in support of the culture sector. And that includes demonstrating this Parliament's collective support for culture in Scotland and voting in support of the Scottish Government's proposal for a significant uplift in culture funding for 2025-26 as part of the Parliamentary process in due course. Through this budget, we will deliver on the culture strategy's central ambition to sustain and nurture the conditions and skills for culture to thrive for the benefit of all. And these include providing an increase of £20 million for Creative Scotland's competitive multi-year funding programme, as well as additional increases for the National Collections, for the National Performing Companies and for Screen Scotland. By allocating new funding to support festivals across Scotland, improving digital access to our public libraries, restarting and extending the community-led arts and creativity programmes, and developing a culture and a heritage capacity fund. By continuing to support Scotland's flagship Sistema and youth music initiatives, and to ensure that all of this additional investment has a desired positive impact right across the sector, supporting a review of sector support needs, including the remit and the functions of Creative Scotland. This planned increase in culture funding has received cross-cabinet approval at a time when the Scottish Government faces tough choices about the funding priorities which will ensure delivery of the First Minister's stated priorities of eradicating child poverty, of growing the economy, of tackling the climate emergency by investing in green energy and infrastructure, and in improving Scotland's public services as an investment in Scotland's future health, equality and prosperity. Presiding Officer, I therefore would urge all members of the Scottish Parliament to support the Scottish Government's budget plans for culture in the coming weeks and make the planned increase in funding support for our vital culture sector a reality. This afternoon we've heard a lot of powerful speeches about why we should be supporting the culture sector, and given the funding pressures which we all acknowledge have existed, it would seem very odd indeed on the one hand to be arguing for increased culture funding and then go on to vote against that or to abstain on that. This is the time to support the Scottish Government's approach to culture funding, to increase culture spending, as well as the other measures that have been announced, and I commend the motion that stands in my name. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on value in culture. Scotland supports the culture sector. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 16112 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to the business programme. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press their request to speak button now, and I call on the Minister to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 16112 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed. And there are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. And can I remind members that if the amendment in the name of Murdo Fraser is agreed to, the amendment in the name of Neil Bibby will fall. And the first question is that amendment 16092.3 in the name of Murdo Fraser, which seeks to amend motion 16092 in the name of Angus Robertson on value in culture, Scotland's support to the culture sector, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system. Is agreed to. The amendment in the name of Neil Bibby will fall. And the question is that Amendment 16092.3 in the name of Murdo Fraser, which seeks to amend Motion 16092 in the name of Angus Robertson on valuing culture, Scotland's support to the culture sector, be agreed. And members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 16092.3 in the name of Murdo Fraser is yes 29, no 88. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And we move on to the next question, which is that amendment 16092.2 in the name of Neil Bibby, which seeks to amend motion 16092 in the name of Angus Robertson on valuing culture, Scotland's support to the culture sector, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 16092.2 in the name of Neil Bibby is yes 24, no 64. There were 28 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the final question is that motion 16092 in the name of Angus Robertson on valuing culture, Scotland's support to the culture sector, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on motion 16092 in the name of Angus Robertson is yes 69, no 23. There were 26 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. That concludes decision time, and we will now move on to members' business in the name of Megan Gallagher.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.